The boy had been screaming for 3 days. Not from pain, not from hunger, from silence. The worst kind. The kind that swallows a child whole when no one around him speaks his language. Doctors walked past. Nurses logged complaints. The administrator wanted him removed. And then a woman in blue scrubs crouched down in the middle of a crowded hospital hallway, said nothing out loud, and moved her hands. 8 seconds. The screaming stopped. A Navy SEAL standing 20 feet away felt the blood drain from his face, not because of the miracle he'd just witnessed, but because he recognized those hands. He had seen them before, on a battlefield, 11 years ago, when everyone said she was dead. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we tell here don't stop at shock. They go all the way to the truth. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The Ravenwood Military Medical Center sat on the edge of Charleston, like it had always been there and always intended to stay. A squat, brutalist structure with glass additions bolted on in phases over decades, each new wing a slightly different shade of gray. The parking lot smelled like diesel from the shuttle buses that ran between the main entrance and the veteran outpatient clinic 3 blocks east. The lobby had a mural on the east wall depicting soldiers and nurses in heroic posture, frozen mid-gesture, painted sometime in the 1980s and touched up badly twice since. Nobody looked at it anymore. Emily Carter had walked past that mural 412 times. She knew because she'd started counting on a bad week 6 months ago and never stopped. It was the kind of habit that kept her grounded, small, private, a little absurd. She was 34 years old, had been a charge nurse at Ravenwood for 2 years, and was considered by most of her colleagues to be quietly competent and somewhat difficult to read. Not cold, not warm either. She did her job. She did it well. She went home. She was doing paperwork at the 3rd floor nurses' station when she heard it. Not heard exactly, felt. The particular pitch of a child's distress carried differently through a hospital than adult sounds did. It cut through the ambient beeping and PA announcements and rubber-soled footsteps with a precision that made experienced medical staff either rush toward it or train themselves to compartmentalize it. Emily had never fully learned the second skill. She set down her pen. Down the corridor, near the elevator bank, a boy was sitting on the floor against the wall with his knees pulled to his chest. I was maybe 8 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and a gray hoodie with a cartoon shark on the chest. His mouth was open, and he was making a sound, a sustained, raw, cycling wail that had the rhythm of someone who had been crying for a very long time and no longer expected it to accomplish anything. His hands were pressed flat against the tile on either side of him. His eyes were open, fixed on nothing. 2 orderlies stood 6 feet away having a conversation about whether to call security. A ward clerk was on the phone, presumably with someone who could make the decision for her. A passing doctor had glanced at the child, said something to a colleague, and kept walking. Emily walked toward the boy. She noted, as she crossed the distance, that he hadn't reacted to any of the noise around him. Not to the gurney that had rattled past, not to the overhead announcement, not to the orderlies' voices. She clocked his hands, the way his fingers were pressed against the floor, not gripping, not braced, just flat and sensing. She clocked his eyes, the particular unfocus that wasn't dissociation but information gathering, peripheral, wide-angled. She stopped 3 feet in front of him and crouched down to his level. He didn't look at her immediately. She waited. She didn't say anything, didn't reach for him, didn't perform the facial expression that adults put on when they wanted a child to know they were safe. She just waited, at his eye level, still. After about 4 seconds, he looked at her. She raised her right hand, palm out, held it steady. Then she signed, "Are you okay?" The boy blinked. She signed again, slower. "My name is Emily. What's yours?" His wailing cut off like a switch had been thrown. Not gradually, immediately. He stared at her hands. Then he raised his own hands, shaking slightly, and signed back, "Ethan, where's my dad?" "Oh, thank God," the ward clerk said behind her into the phone. "Someone got him to stop." Emily didn't turn around. She signed, "Your dad is being taken care of by the doctors." You're safe. Can you tell me what happened? Ethan's hands moved fast, urgent. A child's sign language with the grammar slightly collapsed the way it was when kids were scared. Dad fell down. They took him in there. Nobody talks to me. Nobody tells me anything. I don't know if he's dead. His face crumpled on the last sign. Emily kept her expression steady, not performing calm, just being it, because panic from her would not help him. She signed back. He's not dead. I promise you I will find out exactly what's happening and I will come back and tell you. But first, are you hungry? Ethan blinked again, then very slowly he nodded. Wilson, Emily said without turning around, knowing the ward clerk was still hovering. Can you get a juice box and some crackers from the family lounge? Whatever we have. Yes, absolutely. Emily turned back to Ethan and signed. Food is coming. Will you sit with me while we wait? He looked at her for a long moment, the evaluating look of a child who had been disappointed by adults enough times to have developed skepticism. And then he scooted sideways on the floor to make room beside him. She sat down on the hallway tile. It was not comfortable. Her knees weren't thrilled about it. She sat anyway. She had been sitting there for approximately 90 seconds when she became aware of someone standing at the far end of the corridor, very still, watching her. She registered it the way she registered most things. In her peripheral vision first, then a slow, deliberate shift of attention that didn't telegraph itself. The man was big, not just tall, constructed, the kind of broad through the shoulders that came from years of load-bearing in the literal sense. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark Henley and jeans, but they didn't fit him the way civilian clothes fit civilians. He was holding a paper cup of coffee he hadn't drunk. His face was doing something complicated that she couldn't fully read from this distance. He was also clearly fighting to stay upright. She watched him shift his weight, grip the wall with his free hand, and then deliberately straighten. Someone who had trained himself not to show pain was showing it anyway, in the small betrayals, the jaw, the shoulder, the way he breathed. She filed it away. A nurse named Dennis appeared at her elbow. Carter. Administrator Langford wants the kid moved to the family waiting room on 2. The family waiting room on 2 doesn't have anyone in it who can communicate with him. I know, but Langford says he's blocking the corridor and it's a liability. He's 8 years old and he's scared. Tell Langford I'll move him when he's calm enough to move without escalating. Dennis made the face of a man who did not want to deliver that message. He's going to come down here. He's welcome to. Dennis left. The juice box arrived. Ethan drank half of it in one go, and then looked at the crackers with the suspicion of a child who had been given hospital crackers before. Emily signed, I know, they're bad. Eat them anyway. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Victor Langford arrived 4 minutes later, which was honestly faster than Emily had expected. He was 51, trim in the aggressive way of men who treated fitness as competition, wearing a charcoal suit that was a little too expensive for a hospital administrator, but not quite expensive enough for the message he wanted to send. He had the kind of face that looked like it had once been handsome and was now working very hard to maintain the impression. Carter. He stopped 6 feet away, looking at the tableau on the floor with the expression of a man encountering something that was both beneath him and annoying. This is a corridor, not a waiting room. I'm aware. She didn't stand up. The child needs to be in the appropriate family space. This is disrupting patient flow. He was disrupting patient flow for 3 days before anyone thought to check if he was deaf, Emily said. Now he's calm, he's eating crackers, and moving him right now would undo all of it. Give me 20 minutes. That's not your decision to make. With respect, I'm the charge nurse on this floor, and this is a patient welfare issue. I'm making it my decision. The silence that followed had a specific texture. She had learned over time that there were 2 kinds of silence from men like Langford, the kind that preceded backing down and the kind that preceded escalation. She watched his face and saw the decision form. I'll note this in your performance file, he said. You can note whatever you like. He left. She didn't watch him go. She turned back to Ethan, who had watched the entire exchange with the careful attention of a child who had survived enough adult conflict to read it accurately. He signed, Was that man angry at you? A little bit. Because of me? Because of him, she signed back. Don't worry about it. Ethan looked at her with an expression she recognized, the fractional trust of someone deciding whether to extend it further. Then he signed, My dad. You said you'd find out. I will. Can you stay here and finish your crackers while I check? He considered it with the gravity of a much older person, then nodded. She stood up, and that was when she made the mistake of looking directly at the man at the end of the corridor. He was closer now. He had moved without her clocking it, which annoyed her because she usually clocked things. He was maybe 15 feet away, and he was staring at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not recognition exactly, more like the aftermath of recognition. The thing that happened to a face when it encountered something it had been certain it would never encounter again. "The boy," he said. His voice was low, even. The voice of someone accustomed to controlling it. "He's mine." She understood immediately. The resemblance, once she was looking, the dark hair, the jaw, the particular quality of stillness in the face. "Lieutenant Hale?" She had pulled his chart before coming downstairs. She pulled charts on all the significant admits at the start of a shift, old habit that nobody had ever told her to have. "You should be in your room. I needed to find my son. You found him. He's fine. You need to go back to your room." He stopped crying. He did. "How did you—" He stopped, his jaw tightened. Something moved through his face. "What did you just sign to him?" Standard ASL. His file indicated his primary communication mode was sign language, but nobody on the floor had flagged that the family waiting rooms on 2 and 3 don't have any interpreter resources. So, "Do that again," he said. She went still. "Excuse me?" "The thing you signed to him. Do it again." She studied him for a moment, trying to read what was happening behind his eyes. There was something there she didn't have a framework for. Something old and searching. "Lieutenant, please." The word came out wrong, not a request so much as something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had found a small crack. "I need to see it again." She raised her hand and signed, "Your dad is safe." Marcus Hale's hand found the wall. He pressed his palm flat against it. His coffee cup was gone. She didn't know when he'd set it down. His face had gone to a color that wasn't quite right. "Where did you learn that?" he said quietly. "I took courses." "No." The word was precise and final. "Not a course. Those are precision placements. The way you hold your wrist." He swallowed. "I've only seen that in one context." She didn't answer. "I need to sound," he said, which was the first honest thing either of them had said about the situation. He was swaying, very slightly, and his right hand had pressed harder into the wall. "You need to be back in your room," she said, and she crossed to him in 4 quick steps and got a hand under his arm before he made the decision to fall. He was heavy, considerably more solid than she'd accounted for, and the particular resistance he put up against accepting help was familiar in a way she didn't want to examine. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not fine. Walk." He walked. She walked with him. Behind them, Ethan had spotted his father and was on his feet, and she heard the ward clerk intercepting him gently, keeping him back until they got Marcus stable, and she was grateful for that. They made it to the elevator. She hit the button for the 4th floor. "You have a fragment near your axillary artery," she said. Not because she was supposed to say it there in an elevator, but because something in her had decided the time for not saying things was over. "From an old injury. It's been stable, but there's been a pressure change. The tremors you've been getting in your right hand, that's why." He turned his head and looked at her. The elevator was slow. "That's not in my chart." It wasn't caught in the initial imaging because whoever read the films was looking for soft tissue damage. She watched the floor numbers. "I requested a secondary vascular consult this morning." "Why?" She could have given him the clinical answer. She gave him part of the real one. "Because the medication Dr. Heron ordered for the tremors would cause vasodilation in the presence of a shifting metallic foreign body at that location." She kept her voice flat, informational. "It could kill you." The elevator opened. He didn't move immediately. "Who are you?" he said. Not aggressively, not demanding, the way a person said it when they were asking something underneath the question. She stepped off the elevator and held the door. "Emily Carter," she said. "Charge nurse. 3rd floor." He looked at her for a long moment, the too long look of a man processing something he didn't have the right category for. And then he stepped off the elevator. She walked him back to his room, checked his vitals, made a note in his chart. And then, because she had pulled his full file 3 hours ago and had read every page including the service record summary that was available to medical staff, She stood at the foot of his bed and did the thing she should not have done. She said, "The medication order from Dr. Heron, I'm flagging it for review before it's administered." Marcus was watching her from the bed. His color was still wrong. "Heron's the head of neuro. I know who he is. He's not going to like that." "No," she agreed. "He won't." She wrote the flag. She submitted it through proper channels, which meant it would hit Langford's desk within the hour, which meant this day was going to get considerably more complicated before it got better. She knew this when she did it. She did it anyway. She walked back to her station and picked up her pen and went back to her paperwork, and she did not let herself think about the way Marcus Hale had looked at her hands. She did not let herself think about the 11-year gap between then and now, or the specific geography of that gap, or the people who had been in it. She picked up her pen. She had been writing for 4 minutes when Dennis appeared again, and this time his face said it wasn't Langford. "Dr. Heron's on his way up," Dennis said. "He's not happy." "He won't be the last one today," Emily said. Down the hall, in room 412, Marcus Hale was lying in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling. His right hand had gone still. The tremor had stopped an hour ago, which was not reassuring. The absence of a symptom in this context was not the same as the symptom being gone. He was thinking about a mountain in a country he was not permitted to name. He was thinking about a bridge and a device in 23 seconds. I was thinking about hands that moved with a precision he had never seen before or since, not in 19 years of service, not once. He was thinking about the report he had received afterward, the standard language, the flag and the silence and the finality of it. He was thinking about those hands in a hospital hallway, making his son go quiet. He pressed the call button. When the nurse who answered was not her, he didn't explain what he wanted. He said he was fine. He lay back against the pillow. He was not fine. Down the corridor, the elevator opened, and Dr. Richard Heron stepped out, and he was already speaking before he had fully arrived at the nurse's station, the way important men did when they wanted to make sure the conversation had already begun by the time they reached it, when they wanted to make sure the other person was already slightly behind. Emily set down her pen. She turned to face him, and whatever Heron saw in her face, it made him pause, just briefly, just a fraction, before he resumed. She noted the pause, filed it, did not find it comforting. "Carter," he said, "you flagged my order." "I did." "On what basis?" "The patient has an unidentified metallic foreign body proximal to the axillary artery. The vasodilation profile of the medication you prescribed creates a risk of—" "I know what my medication does. I wrote my medication." His voice was the voice of a man who had been right for so long that wrongness had become theoretically impossible. "You are a charge nurse. You are not a vascular specialist. You are not a physician of any kind. You flagged a department head's order based on— what? A hunch?" "Based on imaging review and clinical observation. The imaging has been read by a radiologist looking for soft tissue damage, not for metallic migration." The silence was different from Langford's silence. Heron was actually thinking, which was marginally more dangerous. She watched him weigh it, his certainty against the small cold seed of what if that all physicians carried somewhere, the thing that kept them from being fully wrong until they were catastrophically wrong. "This is not appropriate," he said finally. "A nurse flagging a physician order is a serious breach of— Protocol allows any clinical staff member to raise a patient safety concern," she said. "I raised one. The appropriate response is a clinical review, not a conversation about what's appropriate." Heron stared at her. "Have the vascular scan done," she said. "If I'm wrong, the flag comes down and we move on. If I'm right—" She let the end of the sentence sit there, unfinished, because the end of the sentence was something neither of them wanted to say out loud. It was Dennis who came to find her 40 minutes later. "Vascular team just called up," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of someone trying not to show that they were shaken. "They found something on the secondary scan." Emily looked at the wall for exactly 2 seconds. "Does Heron know?" "He's with them now." "And Lieutenant Hale?" "Still in his room. They haven't told him yet." She nodded. She picked up her pen again. She wrote one sentence in her notes, the time, the flag, the outcome, and she put the cap back on. Dennis was still standing there. "Carter, you were right." "I know," she said. She didn't say it with satisfaction. She said it the way you said things that were true and terrible and urgent, because what came next was not a moment for satisfaction. What came next was the hard part, the real part, the part where being right meant someone was in danger and the clock was already moving. She was already standing up when the overhead system crackled and a calm, automatic voice said the words that made every person on the fourth floor stop what they were doing. The overhead system said, "Code Blue, room 412. Code Blue, room 412. Emily was moving before the second repetition finished. The hallway between the nurse's station and room 412 was 43 feet. She covered it in less than 6 seconds, which she knew because she had counted it once during a slow shift, the way she counted things, the small private calibrations that kept her oriented. She hit the door shoulder first and took in the room in the way she had trained herself to take in rooms. Total, immediate, no hierarchy of attention. Marcus was conscious. That was the first thing. He was sitting up in the bed with his right arm pressed against his chest, his face the color of old concrete, and he was breathing, short, controlled breaths. The breathing of a man who had decided that breathing carefully was the only thing standing between him and something worse. 2 nurses from the adjacent wing were already in the room. An aide was reaching for the crash cart in the hallway. "He's conscious," Emily said to the room, loudly enough to redirect everyone. "Hold the cart. Somebody get me a BP reading right now." She crossed to his bedside and put 2 fingers to his wrist without asking permission. His pulse was there, present, irregular, too fast. His right hand, when she looked at it, had the faint bluish tinge of compromised circulation. "What happened?" she asked him directly. "Sharp pain," Marcus said. The words came out metered, rationed. "Right shoulder, radiating down. Scale. 7, 8. A pause. 8. Has it changed in the last 30 seconds? He thought about it, which told her he was still processing accurately. "Holding steady." "Okay." She turned. "I need the vascular team up here now, not in 10 minutes. Someone call down and tell them we don't have 10 minutes. And I need a portable ultrasound, not a transport. We're not moving him." "Heron already ordered transport to imaging," one of the other nurses said. "Heron ordered transport before we knew the fragment had moved. Call him and tell him the situation has changed." She looked at Marcus. "Can you straighten your arm for me?" He unclenched it from his chest with visible effort. The movement made something cross his face. Not quite a wince, something flatter and harder than that. The face of someone who had practiced not showing pain until the practice had become structural. She watched the arm, watched the hand, pressed 2 fingers gently along the inside of his bicep, and found what she was looking for. "There," she said quietly. "There what?" Marcus said. "The fragment's sitting against the vessel wall. It hasn't perforated. You'd know if it had. But the position has changed since this morning's imaging." She kept her voice even. Not performed calm, but functional calm, the kind that had a use. "The pain you're feeling is vascular pressure. It's going to stay uncomfortable, but as long as you don't move suddenly and we get the right people in here in the next few minutes, we are not in the worst scenario. Define worst scenario." "You don't need me to define it." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't." Dr. Heron arrived at 3 minutes past the code call, which meant he had been somewhere close, either still in the building after the earlier conversation or already on his way up. Emily wasn't sure which, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the look on his face when he walked in and saw Emily standing at Marcus's bedside with the portable ultrasound tech behind her, the machine already warming up, the vascular consult on the phone relaying instructions she was executing with a precision that had made the other nurses in the room go quiet in a specific way. "Carter." Heron's voice had a new quality in it. Not anger, something more complicated. The recalibration of a man who was deciding in real time how much to adjust his position. "What's the status?" "Fragment has migrated approximately 3 millimeters since this morning. Current position is proximal to the axillary, pressing against the vessel wall. No perforation detected. Patient is stable but vascular compromised in the right arm. I've been in contact with Dr. Aldous Fenn from Vascular. He's 10 minutes out, and he wants the room cleared to 4 people maximum when he arrives." Heron absorbed this. "The medication was not administered," Emily said. The flag held. Another recalibration. She could see it happening. The small, almost imperceptible shift in how he was holding his shoulders, the way his chin adjusted a fraction of an inch. He was not a stupid man. Stupid men were, in some ways, easier. Good call on the flag, he said finally, and the words cost him something, she could tell, though not as much as they should have. He turned to the other nurses and began issuing orders. Good orders, accurate orders, the kind that confirmed he was a competent physician when the situation made competence mandatory. And Emily stepped back slightly to give him the room and turned back to Marcus. Marcus was watching Heron. Then he looked at Emily. "You knew," he said, low, under the noise of the room reorganizing itself. "I suspected. I confirmed." "How?" She reached past him to check the ultrasound readout without quite answering the question, and he let her, because the right arm was more important than the answer right now, and they both understood that. What she did not tell him, in that moment, was that she had seen this injury presentation before. Not in a hospital. In a field station with inadequate equipment and a man who had been 37 years old and terrified and trying not to show it while she did the only thing available to her, which was to stabilize what she could with what she had, and pray the helicopter arrived before the pressure changed. That man had survived. She didn't know where he was now. She had not allowed herself to know where anyone from that period was. She had built her not knowing deliberately, the way you constructed a wall, one decision at a time, each one load-bearing. Marcus's right hand, she noticed, had stopped tremoring. It was not a good sign. The next 7 minutes were controlled chaos of the surgical kind, the kind that looked like disorder from the outside but had a structure underneath it, if you knew where to look. Fen arrived at 8 minutes, which was faster than 10, which meant the call had communicated urgency accurately. I was a compact man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the hands of someone who had spent decades doing delicate things under pressure, and when he entered the room, he went directly to the ultrasound readout without greeting anyone and said, "Who flagged the original order?" "I did," Emily said. He looked at her. Just a look, brief and assessing. Then he looked back at the readout. "Good eyes," he said, and moved on, because there wasn't time for anything more than that, and he knew it. The room cleared to 4 people plus Fen. Emily was one of the 4. Heron was not. That was Fen's call, made without discussion, and Heron received it with a stillness that Emily noted and filed. What followed was the particular intensity of a medical situation that was serious but not yet catastrophic, the narrow corridor between bad and worse where competent people worked best. Fen directed, Emily assisted, the other 2 nurses managed monitoring and equipment with the precision of people who knew their jobs and were not being managed by someone who doubted it. Marcus cooperated with the thoroughness of a man who had been in enough critical situations to understand that cooperation was the most useful thing he could contribute right now. At one point, Fen said to Emily, without looking up, "Pressure reading." She gave it. "Again in 90 seconds. "Understood." At another point, Marcus said, "Is it going to hold?" Fen said, "For now, we're scheduling emergency surgery for tomorrow morning, first slot. Tonight we stabilize and monitor. And if it doesn't hold?" "Then tonight," Fen said. He was not unkind. He was precise, which was more useful. Marcus said nothing to that. He turned his head slightly and looked at the window, which showed a rectangle of Charleston twilight, going orange and purple at the edges. And Emily watched him do the math. The same math everyone did in hospital beds when they were forced to confront the gap between what they'd assumed about tomorrow and what tomorrow might actually hold. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the adjustment, the recalculation. She had done it herself, once, in a different context. She knew what it looked like from the inside. By the time the room had stabilized and Fen had given his interim orders and stepped out to document, it was past 7 in the evening, and the 4th floor had taken on the particular quality of late-day hospital, quieter, slower, the shift change bringing a different set of faces, and a slightly lower energy that had nothing to do with urgency decreasing and everything to do with humans being humans, tired, running through end-of-day motions while trying to stay sharp. Emily had been on since 6 that morning. She had not eaten since noon. She was aware of both facts in the distanced way she became aware of physical needs during extended focus. Noted, acknowledged, deprioritized. She was updating the chart at the nurse's station when Dennis appeared again. The frequency of Dennis's appearances had become a reliable indicator of escalation, and his face right now confirmed it. "Langford's called a meeting," Dennis said. "Tonight. Department heads and charge nurses, 7:30, conference room B." "About?" Dennis didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. He's going to make it about me, Emily said. Not a question. He's framing it as a protocol review, but yeah. Dennis looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not the discomfort of someone who didn't care, but of someone who cared and felt useless about it. Carter, the flag you put on Heron's order. Technically, it was within protocol, but the way you did it, going around the floor charge before it hit his desk. The floor charge was in surgery. I had a time-sensitive safety concern. Protocol allows direct escalation under those conditions, subsection 4 of the Patient Safety Guidelines. I know. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying Langford is going to say you were wrong. Emily put down her pen. She was quiet for a moment. What time did you say? 7:30. I'll be there. Dennis lingered. Is there anything, if there's anything I can do? She looked at him. Actually looked. Not the quick calibrating glance she gave most things, but a real look, because Dennis had been decent to her consistently for 2 years, and she did not always acknowledge that the way she should. I'm okay, she said. But thank you. He nodded and left, and she sat with the chart for a moment without writing anything, which was unusual for her. She was not afraid of Langford's meeting. That was not what was happening inside her. What was happening was harder to name, a specific quality of tiredness that had nothing to do with the hours she'd been awake, the tiredness of being accurate and having it treated as a problem, the tiredness of doing the right thing through channels and procedures and proper documentation and still being the person who walked into a room at 7:30 to defend it. She had felt this before, in a different institution with different ranks attached to the people who doubted her. The texture was the same. She picked up her pen. She finished the chart. She went to check on Ethan. He was in the family consultation room on the 4th floor now, not the family waiting room on 2, which had no interpreter resources, and which Emily had formally escalated to the patient services coordinator at 5 p.m. in a 3-paragraph written memo that cited the hospital's own ADA compliance documentation. The consultation room had a tablet loaded with an ASL video relay service. Emily had set it up herself at 4:15. The ward clerk who had helped her earlier had stayed 20 minutes past the end of her shift to get it working. Ethan was sitting at the table with the tablet, watching something on it. One of the relay service's preloaded educational videos, she realized, the one about how hospitals worked, designed for pediatric deaf patients. He had eaten. Someone had found him a better dinner than crackers, actual food, from the cafeteria, and she suspected Dennis had organized that without being asked. When she knocked on the open door frame, he looked up and signed immediately. Is my dad okay? He's stable. The doctors have a plan. He'll need surgery tomorrow morning, but tonight he's safe. Ethan absorbed this with the careful seriousness of a child who had learned not to receive reassurance without examining it first. Then, are you telling me the truth or the thing adults say to make kids feel better? She held his gaze. The truth. He's not out of danger yet, but the right people are taking care of it. I promise I'll tell you if anything changes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he signed. You know a lot of signs. I learned a long time ago. Why? She paused. She could give him the simple answer, the one she gave everyone, the course, the continuing education unit, the colleague who had introduced her to it. It was a perfectly accurate partial truth. She had given it 50 times. Someone I knew needed me to, she signed instead, and that was all. And Ethan seemed to understand that it was all, the way children sometimes understood the shapes of things they hadn't been told explicitly. She left him at 7:20 and walked to conference room B. The room was set up in the standard administrative configuration. Long table, chairs on both sides, a projector screen at one end currently displaying the Ravenwood Hospital logo, which was a stylized tree in navy blue that had always struck Emily as optimistic given the building's general aesthetic. Langford was at the head of the table. Heron was 3 seats to his left. The nursing director, a careful woman named Brenda Solis, who had navigated institutional politics with the skill of someone who had survived several administrations, was at the other end. 2 other department heads Emily knew by face and name were present. Dennis was not there. This was above his level. Emily sat in the middle of one side, which was neither a power position nor a submissive one. She put her hands on the table and waited. Langford opened with 10 minutes of framing that was technically about protocol and actually about control, the way these things usually were. He used the words chain of command 4 times. He used appropriate escalation 3 times. He did not use Emily Carter at all in the first 10 minutes, referring instead to the incident and the nursing staff action in ways that made the subject grammatically diffuse without being unclear. Brenda Solis interrupted at the 11-minute mark. Victor, can we just name what we're talking about? Emily flagged a physician order, the flag was validated by the vascular consult, and the patient is alive and stable because of it. What specifically is the protocol concern? Langford's expression did not change in any dramatic way. The adjustment was minimal, a slight compression around the eyes, the kind that meant he'd expected this and had something prepared. The concern is the unilateral nature of the action. The concern is a charge nurse circumventing the floor hierarchy under the justification of a time-sensitive situation that she herself assessed without physician backup. The floor charge was unavailable, Emily said. Then the correct procedure was to contact the on-call attending. I contacted vascular directly because the flag required a specialist opinion, not a general attending. That's documented in the incident report I filed at 5:43. She looked at him steadily. Which you've had for an hour and a half. A brief silence. I read your report, Langford said. It's thorough. It's also a retroactive justification for an action that it's a contemporaneous record. The timestamps are in the system. She kept her voice neutral. Not combative, neutral, which was more unnerving than combative because it gave him less to work with. Every step I took is logged with the time I took it. The flag was raised 41 minutes before the code blew in room 412. The vascular consult was initiated through proper channels 12 minutes after the flag. The medication was not administered because the flag held, which is the system working as designed. Heron had not said anything yet. He said something now. The flag was correct. 4 words, stated toward the table rather than at anyone. The clinical reasoning was accurate. I've reviewed the imaging sequence and I agree with Carter's assessment of the migration pattern. Langford looked at Heron. Heron did not look back at Langford. He looked at Emily briefly, with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. Not quite respect, not quite apology, something in the neighborhood of both without arriving at either. The order would have caused a vascular event, he said, potentially fatal. The flag prevented that. The room was quiet. Langford regrouped with the smoothness of someone who had practiced regrouping. I appreciate Dr. Heron's perspective. The clinical outcome is not in dispute. The process question remains. He turned back to Emily. Carter, this hospital runs on clear lines of authority. When those lines are, the patient is alive, Emily said. She said it simply, without emphasis, the way you stated something that did not require emphasis. The lines of authority are important. They're not more important than the patient being alive. Langford looked at her with something that had moved past professional disapproval into something more personal, and she recognized that shift because she had seen it before. The moment when a man who expected friction decided that the friction was coming from something structural rather than situational. He had decided she was a problem type, not a problem instance. She had seen that decision made about her before, and she knew what it meant for what came next. We'll table the process discussion, Langford said. For now, there will be a formal review of this incident. He looked at Emily. You'll receive documentation of the review process by end of week. Understood, Emily said. She left the meeting at 8:14. She stood in the hallway outside conference room B for a moment, alone, looking at the opposite wall, which had a laminated poster about hand hygiene compliance. She was tired in the specific way that came from spending energy on the wrong battle while the right battle sat in a room upstairs. She was also aware, in the careful and honest part of herself, she tried to maintain that she had handled the meeting well, not perfectly, but accurately, and that handling it well hadn't changed what Langford had decided about her before she walked in. She was walking back toward the elevators when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, which under normal circumstances she wouldn't have engaged with. But the first 4 words made her stop walking. Emily. It's Marcus Hale. She stared at it. Then, they gave me a phone. Apparently I get one if I promise not to leave my room again. I need to talk to you, not about the fragment. She stood still in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she typed back, I'll come up. He was sitting up in the bed when she arrived, not lying back, the position of someone who had been waiting and didn't want to be caught resting. He'd pulled the bed's tray table around, and there was a notepad on it with some handwriting she didn't read. His right arm was immobilized in a soft brace. His color was better than this afternoon. He looked like a man who had decided to have a conversation he'd been avoiding and was now committed to having it. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "I'd feel better if you sat." She pulled the chair from the corner and sat. She put her hands in her lap and waited. Marcus looked at the window. Then he looked at his right hand. Then he looked at her. 11 years ago, he said. Operation Coldwater Ridge, you know what I'm talking about. The words landed in her chest with the particular weight of things that had been sealed for a long time being unsealed. She kept her face where she'd put it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." "Lieutenant Hale, my team was 9 people. We were in a location I still can't name in a filing that still doesn't exist officially. There was an IED, layered, sophisticated, the kind that wasn't supposed to be there, and a bomb technician appeared from the support unit and cleared it in 23 seconds. He stopped. The pause was doing work. Not dramatic work, just the work of a man who had carried something for 11 years and was placing it down carefully. I have thought about those 23 seconds more times than I can count. 9 men went home because of those 23 seconds. I went home. I watched you work, and I thought, I will never forget this person as long as I live. Emily said nothing. The report said you were lost in the extraction, casualty. The official language was... He stopped again. We had a memorial. I said something at the memorial. The silence stretched. I'm sorry, she said finally, and she meant it, and it was not enough, and she knew that. What happened? He said. The real version. She looked at her hands. This was the place where she had always stopped. In every version of this moment she had imagined. And she had imagined it, she was honest with herself about that. In the small hours when the wall she'd built was less load-bearing than she needed it to be. This was the place where saying the real thing meant the wall came down. And everything she'd constructed on the other side of it, the quiet, the routine, the counting of hallway tiles, the person she'd made herself into, was revealed as built on something that had an expiration date. There was a secondary device, she said. Her voice came out level. I found it during the extraction sweep. I couldn't call it in because the communication window had closed. I cleared it, but the concussive force, I had a TBI. Significant one. I was evacuated through a different route. By the time I was stable enough to communicate, there had been a documentation error. She paused. A significant one. They listed you dead. They listed me dead. And you didn't correct it. She looked at him. I corrected it. Eventually. There's paperwork somewhere in a classified archive that has my correct status. But by the time the correction was filed, I had already been discharged on medical grounds. The TBI had left me with issues, auditory processing, reaction time on the right side. I wasn't fit for EOD anymore. She said the last sentence with a flatness that cost her more than the flat sound suggested. I retrained, I became a nurse, I moved, I built something. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You could have reached out. To the unit. To anyone. I know. 9 men would have wanted to know you were alive. I know that too. So why? Because, she said. And then she stopped. And then she said it anyway because he had asked honestly and she owed him honest. Because it was easier to be someone who had moved forward than someone who had to explain why she'd stayed away so long. Because I was ashamed of the time it took me to recover, and I didn't know how to go back and explain that to people who had never stopped. Because she stopped. Because I was different after. The person I was before that operation and the person I was after it were not the same person, and I didn't know how to introduce the after person to people who had only known the before. Marcus looked at her for a long time. She held it. His gaze and the weight of what she'd said, which was the most she had said about any of it to anyone in 11 years. And the room felt strange because of it, like air after weather. The signing, he said finally. Ethan, when did you learn? After the TBI. The auditory processing issues were worst in the first 2 years. I learned sign language partly as an adaptive tool, partly because she almost didn't finish. A child in my building was deaf. She was isolated. It seemed useful. Something moved through Marcus's face that she didn't have an easy name for. It wasn't pity, which she wouldn't have tolerated. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more complicated. The recognition of a person who had taken a hard thing and made it into a different hard thing, which was not the same as healing, but was its own form of work. Ethan's been deaf since birth, Marcus said. His mother and I split 4 years ago. She has primary custody. He's with me right now because it's complicated. A pause. He doesn't have a lot of adults in his life who sign fluently. His interpreter at school is okay. His mom is conversational. He looked at his immobilized arm. I've been trying to get better. My signs are slow. They're not bad, Emily said, and it was true. She had watched him during the brief moment in the hallway when he'd tried to sign to Ethan before she'd reached them, and his ASL was functional, the grammar a little stiff, but the effort real. They're not good enough, he said. He stopped. He needs people. She understood what he wasn't saying, and she didn't make him say it. They were quiet for a moment, and it was a different quality of quiet than the one that had preceded it. Not the silence of things being concealed, but the silence of things that had been said still settling. Then Marcus's face changed. It happened fast. The color shift, the jaw, the way his right hand pressed suddenly into the mattress. Marcus, Emily said, and she was already up from the chair. He stopped. The arm. Something's... She hit the call button with one hand and had her fingers on his wrist with the other. The pulse was there, but the rhythm had changed. Not in the way of catastrophic failure, but in the way of something shifting, something moving that shouldn't be moving, the body doing its quiet version of an alarm. Don't move your arm, she said. Keep your elbow down, don't rotate the shoulder. I know, he said through his teeth. I know, I'm not. I need you to breathe slowly, in through the nose. I know how to breathe. Then do it. He breathed. She watched the pulse. The nurse who answered the call button got a 5-word summary and a 3-word order, and the line went dead. She heard the overhead page begin. Marcus's face was the color it had been this afternoon. That concrete gray, the body pulling blood to where it was needed. His right hand had gone almost entirely white. The surgery, he said. You said tomorrow morning. That was the plan. Is the plan still the plan? She looked at the pulse under her fingers. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face, and she did not look away, because she was not going to give him performed calm right now. She was going to give him accurate information delivered without panic, which was a different thing and more useful. I'm going to tell Fen you need to be assessed right now, she said, and then Fen is going to make the call. Okay, Marcus said, and then quieter. If it goes tonight, Ethan, someone needs to... He won't be alone, she said. I promise you that. The door opened and 2 nurses came in fast, and after them a resident, and the room reorganized itself again into the controlled urgency of people doing their jobs. And in the middle of it, Marcus looked at Emily across the room. Just for a second, the way people looked at each other across the noise of a situation when they needed to confirm that the other person was still there. And she looked back. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look at it. Then, 3 minutes into the stabilization, the door opened again, and the person who walked through it was not Fen, was not Heron, was not anyone from the medical staff. It was a man in his late 50s in a dark suit, with a military bearing so ingrained it had become posture rather than performance, and a visitor badge clipped to his lapel that had a different color coding than the standard issue, a color Emily recognized, with a sudden sharp clarity, from a different period of her life. He looked at the room. He looked at Marcus. And then he looked at Emily, and his expression did something that no one else in the room could have read correctly, because it required a specific knowledge to decode. It was the expression of a man who had looked at a casualty report 11 years ago and was now revising everything he thought he knew. He said very quietly, Sergeant Carter. Emily's hands, which had not been still since she'd walked through the door, went still. The word landed in the room differently than any sound that had come before it. Not because it was loud. The man had said it quietly, almost carefully, the way you said something you weren't entirely sure would survive contact with reality, but because of what it was. A rank. Her rank. From a time that had no business being in this room, in this hospital, in this version of her life that she had built with deliberate, daily, incremental effort over 11 years. Emily did not move for exactly 2 seconds. She was aware of the 2 seconds because she counted them, involuntarily, the old reflex, the one that had never fully left regardless of how many layers she'd put on top of it. Then she moved. She turned back to Marcus's bed because Marcus was the reason she was in the room, and his condition had not paused for the entrance of a man in a dark suit, and she said to the resident, "Pressure reading, where are we?" 140/90, up from, "I see it. Get Fen on the phone directly, not through the page. Tell him we need a status call in the next 4 minutes." She adjusted the monitoring lead that had shifted during Marcus's last movement, checked the brace position on his arm, looked at his face. "Still an 8? 7, Marcus said. He was watching the man in the doorway. "Maybe 7. Breathe." "I'm breathing." "Slower." The resident stepped out to make the call. One of the other nurses was documenting vitals with the focused attention of someone who was doing their job and consciously not listening to everything else in the room, which was its own form of professionalism. Emily kept her hands doing what they needed to do and her back partially to the man at the door, which was not an accident. "Carter," his voice again. "Same register." "I'm with a patient," she said. "If you're not medical staff, I need you to wait outside." A pause. Then, "I'll wait." She heard him step back into the hallway, but not far. Close enough that she could feel the presence of him, the way you felt a drop in barometric pressure. She had always had that, the environmental awareness, the sense of the space around her as information. The TBI had dimmed it in the first years. It had come back, modified, not entirely the same, but functional. Fen called back in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Emily took the call, gave him the updated status. The pressure change, the color change in the hand, the shifted pulse rhythm. And Fen said, "I'm coming in, tonight." No elaboration, no qualification. Just that, and the call ended. She told Marcus, "Surgery tonight. Fen's on his way." Marcus absorbed it. "How long?" "He'll be here in 40 minutes, maybe less. Prep will take another 30. You'll be in the OR before midnight." "Ethan?" "I'll handle Ethan, I told you." He looked at her. The pain was still there. She could see it in the set of his face, the shallow quality of his breathing. But underneath it was something else. The particular expression of a person deciding how much to trust someone based on evidence rather than inclination. He had always been, she suspected, a man who made that distinction. "Okay," he said, one word, and it meant more than one word. She stepped out of the room. The man in the dark suit was standing in the hallway exactly where she'd known he would be, not leaning against the wall, not checking his phone, just standing with his hands clasped loosely behind his back and his weight evenly distributed, the posture of someone who had learned to wait in uncomfortable places without advertising the discomfort. He was 60, maybe 61, with a face that had weathered in the specific way of people who had spent significant time outdoors in difficult conditions. His eyes were gray and direct, and they found her immediately when she came through the door. His visitor badge said, "Admiral D. Cross, authorized personnel." She looked at the badge. She looked at him. "Admiral Cross," she said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Emily." He corrected himself immediately. "Sergeant Carter." "Carter's fine." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just occupying her own space, her own posture, making clear the geometry of this conversation. "How did you find me?" Lieutenant Hale's admission generated a flag in a system I monitor. When I pulled his current records and saw the nursing staff assignments, he paused. "Your name went through a database that still has your service record attached to it. Incorrectly marked, as it turns out." "I know how it's marked." "You never corrected it." "I corrected it. The correction is in the archive. Nobody looked at the archive." He studied her with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had understood. "You could have come back, after the discharge, after the medical, after everything. There were options. There are people who would have—" "I didn't want options," she said. "I wanted a life." "You have one." "Yes. I built it. It's mine." She looked at him steadily. "What are you doing here, Admiral? And I need the real answer, not the one about database flags." Cross looked at the floor for a moment. It was a small gesture, brief, almost invisible, but she recognized it as the tell it was, because men like Cross did not look at floors casually. They did it when they were about to say something that cost them something. Marcus Hale is one of the most decorated active operators in the current SEAL program, Cross said. His son is 8 years old and deaf and has nobody here except a father who's going into emergency surgery. When the flag came up and I saw your name, he stopped. I came to make sure the situation was handled correctly. The situation is being handled correctly. Fen is an excellent vascular surgeon. Ethan is safe. I also came, Cross said, more quietly, because I owed you something, years ago, and I didn't pay it. Emily looked at him. The documentation error, he said. The casualty report. There were people who should have looked harder and didn't. I was one of them. He held her gaze. I should have looked harder. She stood with that for a moment. Not the anger, because the anger was old and she had made her accommodations with it, but the specific quality of finally hearing the thing said that you had waited for without admitting you were waiting. It didn't fix anything. It didn't reconstruct the years or the recovery or the person she'd been before and wasn't anymore. But it was a real thing, accurately stated by a person with the authority to have stated it sooner and hadn't. All right, she said. And then because she was not the person who performed forgiveness for other people's comfort, I need to go check on the boy. She left him in the hallway. Ethan was still in the consultation room, but he had moved from the table to the window, standing with his forehead almost touching the glass, looking out at the parking lot below with the patient attention of a child who had run out of distractions. When Emily knocked on the frame, he turned around fast. The sharp pivot of someone who had been waiting for news and had been steeling themselves for bad news, because that's what waiting had taught them to expect. She signed before he could sign first. Your dad is going into surgery tonight, earlier than we planned. That's actually a good sign. It means the doctors are moving fast to fix the problem. Ethan's face did the thing it did. The rapid processing, the control he exercised over his expression that was unusual for an 8-year-old and spoke to specific kinds of experience. Then, is he going to be okay? The surgeon is very good. Your dad is strong. The plan is good. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it's nothing because it isn't nothing, but I'm going to stay here while you wait, and I'm going to tell you exactly what's happening at every step, okay? Ethan looked at her. Then he signed, Promise? Promise. He nodded once, a small, serious nod. Then he signed, Can we sit by the window? They sat by the window. Below, in the parking lot, Fen's car pulled in at 10:40. She recognized it from the parking spot position, the specific angled way he parked, a detail she had cataloged without meaning to. She watched him walk across the lot with the unhurried speed of a surgeon who had learned that running made other people panic, and panic made everything harder. She signed to Ethan. The surgeon just arrived. Ethan watched the parking lot. Then he signed, What's his name? Dr. Fen. He's been doing this for a long time. He's good. How do you know he's good? I watched him work this afternoon. She paused. He asked the right questions, and he didn't waste any moves. Ethan seemed to find this satisfactory. He looked back out the window. After a moment he signed, My dad talks about you. Emily went still. What do you mean? Not you specifically. He doesn't know your name, but he talks about someone, a person who saved his team a long time ago. He signs it sometimes when he thinks I'm not watching. A pause, Ethan's small hands moving with the careful grammar of a child selecting words. He signs, The one who saved us. Like it's a name. Emily looked at the window, at the parking lot, at the lights of Charleston visible at the edges of the building, orange and white and steady. I didn't know that, she signed. Is it you? She looked at Ethan. He was watching her with his father's directness. The same quality, different age, the same instinct to wait for an honest answer rather than accept a comfortable one. Yes, she signed. A long time ago. Ethan looked at his hands. Then he signed slowly. Thank you. She didn't sign anything back. She just sat with it, which was the only honest response available. The surgery prep took 37 minutes. Marcus was moved to the OR at 11:22. Emily knew the time because she walked alongside the gurney as far as the surgical corridor doors, which was as far as she was permitted to go, and she looked at the clock on the wall because she always looked at clocks, and the time was 11:22. Marcus looked at her from the gurney. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But he raised his left hand, the uninjured one, and made a sign, slow and deliberate and slightly imprecise in the way of someone still learning, but unmistakable. Thank you. She watched the doors close behind him. Then she turned around, and Admiral Cross was standing at the end of the corridor, and next to him, which was new, which she had not anticipated, was Victor Langford, and Langford's face had the particular quality of a man who was recalibrating his understanding of what was happening around him and not finding the recalibration comfortable. She walked toward them. There was no point in not walking toward them. I asked Admiral Cross to brief me on the situation, Langford said, and she could hear in his voice that he was managing his response, his posture, his interpretation of the last 4 hours, doing the rapid institutional calculation of a man who had taken a position and was now checking whether the position still made sense, given new information. The situation, Emily said, is that your patient is in emergency surgery that was necessitated partly by an imaging oversight on admission and partly by a medication order that would have killed him if it had been administered. Both of those are documented. She kept her voice level. The formal review you mentioned can include all of that documentation. Langford's jaw moved. Carter, I've been on shift for 17 hours, she said. I have a child to sit with. We can have this conversation tomorrow. She turned before he could respond. Cross's voice came from behind her. Carter. She stopped but didn't turn. The protocol review he's planning. I want you to know I intend to be available to speak to the board, if needed. She stood with her back to him for a moment. That's your decision, she said. She walked back to the consultation room. Ethan was asleep when she got there. He had curled up on the small couch with his head on his arm, still in his shark hoodie, and the tablet with the relay service was dark on the table. She sat in the chair across from him, and she did not sleep, because she did not trust herself to sleep and then wake correctly if someone needed her, and also because her mind was doing the thing it did when events had moved faster than her processing, running back through the sequence, checking her decisions, identifying where she had been accurate and where she had operated on incomplete information and what the difference would have looked like in the outcomes. The medication flag? Correct. The direct contact with the vascular team? Correct, given the timeline. The meeting with Langford, she had been accurate but not strategic, which was not always the same thing. She could have been less direct in the meeting. She had chosen not to be, and she stood by the choice, but she registered that it had a cost. The conversation with Marcus. The things she had said. That was different. Not a decision in the tactical sense, but something she had done because the alternative was continuing to not do it. And she had been not doing it for 11 years. And the weight of not doing it had become, over time, something she carried without noticing until she set it down and felt the difference. She was still sitting in the chair at 2:17 in the morning when her pager went off. She looked at the number. It was the OR. Her first thought, the one that arrived before rationality did, the animal one, was the thing nobody wanted to think. Her second thought, arriving immediately behind it, was they would not page the charge nurse from the OR unless it was procedural. If something had gone wrong with Marcus, they would page the attending or the department, not her. She looked at Ethan, still asleep, and stepped into the hallway to call back. It was a surgical nurse. Dr. Fenn asked me to let you know. Procedure is going well. Fragment is out. They're in the repair phase. Estimated 2 more hours. Emily exhaled. Thank you. He also said, and I'm quoting here, tell Carter the imaging call was textbook. He wanted you to know. She stood in the hallway for a moment after the call ended. The fluorescent lights hummed. Down at the far end, the night shift nurses' station had the specific quiet of 2 in the morning, a single nurse charting, a monitor beeping at the regular intervals of a ward at rest. She went back to the consultation room. She sat down. And because she was human and had been awake for over 20 hours, and the crisis had shifted from imminent to managed, she let herself be tired for a few minutes, which was different from resting. It was just the acknowledgement of the state, the body's brief permission to know what it was carrying. She was still there when the door opened at 6:12 in the morning, and the person who walked in was not a nurse or a doctor or an admiral. It was Brenda Solis, the nursing director, and she had the expression of a woman who had been up for a while and had decided something during the hours she'd been up. She looked at Emily in the chair. She looked at Ethan on the couch. She sat down in the remaining chair without preamble. Fenn called me at 5, Brenda said. Surgery was successful. Marcus Hale is in recovery. Barring complications, he'll be in a step-down room by noon. Emily nodded. He also sent a formal commendation to my office. For you, filed at 4:58 in the morning, which tells you something about how he spent his post-op hour. Brenda looked at her hands for a moment. Victor is going to push the protocol review. I know. He's already spoken to 2 board members. I assumed. Heron has also spoken to 2 board members. Brenda looked up. On your behalf. Apparently he was very clear about the clinical facts. Emily absorbed that. Heron, the man who had spent 11 minutes at that meeting not making eye contact. She had not expected that. She registered the unexpectedness of it without discounting the fact that he should have been clearer sooner when it would have cost him more. But people were people, and arriving at the right position late was still different from not arriving. What are you telling me? Emily said. I'm telling you the board meeting is scheduled for Friday and I want you prepared. Brenda paused. I'm also telling you that Admiral Cross spent 40 minutes on the phone with our hospital board chair last night. I don't know what was said. The board chair called me at 5:30 to ask for your complete personnel file going back to higher date. Emily was quiet. Your file is excellent, Brenda said. 2 years, 0 incidents before this week, multiple commendations from patients and families, 1 notation from Langford about corridor conduct that I've always thought was thin. She looked directly at Emily. Is there anything in your background that the board is going to find that I should know about before Friday? Anything that could be used against you? The question sat in the air between them. Honest, practical, the question of someone who was trying to help and needed accurate information to do it. Emily looked at the window. The Charleston morning was coming in, gray-pink, early, the kind of light that made everything look provisional. Ethan was still asleep. His chest rose and fell with the easy regularity of a child who had, at some point in the night, stopped bracing for the worst. There's a classified service record, Emily said. Mostly redacted. It will look incomplete. Brenda waited. I was in the military before nursing school, EOD specialist, combat medic secondary qualification. I was medically discharged after a TBI. She kept her voice even and informational. The discharge is documented. The service record is classified at a level that the board won't be able to access in full. What they can access will look like gaps. That what Cross knows? Cross knows the full version. Brenda nodded slowly. Will he speak to those gaps if asked? He said he would speak to the board if needed. Another nod. Brenda stood up, smoothed her jacket, and looked at Emily with the expression of a person who had made a decision. Friday, be there. She moved toward the door. Get some sleep before then. You look terrible. Thank you, Brenda. Don't thank me. Just be prepared. She left. Emily sat for another few minutes. Then Ethan stirred on the couch. A small movement, the resurface of consciousness, the moment before waking. And she watched him come back to the room, watched his eyes open and focus and find her, and watched the immediate question form on his hands before he was fully upright. She signed before he could finish. Surgery went well. Your dad is in recovery. You can see him this afternoon. Ethan's face did the thing she had learned to read over the last 18 hours. The careful, complicated rearrangement of a child processing good news with the wariness of someone who had received promising information that later proved wrong. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped about an inch. It was a small movement. It was everything. He signed, Really? Really? He pressed his hands flat against his knees, the same gesture as the first time she'd seen him, on the hallway floor, but different now. Not bracing, just breathing. Just being a child who had gotten through a hard night and was arriving at the other side of it. She was still sitting with him when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a text from a Ravenwood internal number she recognized as the administrator's office. She opened it. Carter, Langford, need you in my office, 8 a.m., non-negotiable. She checked the time, 6:41. She had just over an hour. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at Ethan, who was watching her face with the particular attention of a child who had learned to read adults' reactions for information they weren't given directly. She signed, I need to go talk to some people in a little while. I'm going to ask someone to sit with you until I'm back. Is that okay? Ethan studied her. Then, the bad administrator? The one who was angry at you yesterday? She didn't ask how he knew. She suspected he had seen more yesterday than she'd realized, or had read the room in the way children did when adults thought they weren't paying full attention. Something like that, she signed. Don't worry about it. Are they going to make you leave? She looked at him, at his face, which was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing it. She signed, honestly, they're going to try. Ethan's hands came up. He signed with the deliberate care of someone choosing words that mattered. Don't let them. She held his gaze. She did not sign that she would be fine, because she didn't know if she would be fine, and she had promised him honest. She did not sign that everything would work out, because she didn't know that either. She signed instead, I'm going to do what I came here to do. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the same small, serious nod as before. She stood up. She straightened her scrubs. She had been wearing them for over 24 hours and they showed it, but there was nothing to be done about that now. She went to the door and she had her hand on the frame when she heard Ethan sign behind her. Not in words she had to turn around to read, but in the slight sound of his hands moving, which she had learned to track peripherally, and she stopped and turned. He had signed one word, just one. Hero. She looked at him across the room, this 8-year-old boy in a shark hoodie who had cried in a hallway because no one would speak his language, and who had his father back, and who was watching her with eyes that had seen more than an 8-year-old should have seen and hadn't stopped being 8 because of it. She signed back, nurse. He signed, both. She turned before he could see her face do what it did. Langford's office was on the second floor, corner position, the kind of office that signaled authority through real estate rather than content. She arrived at 7:58 because arriving at 7:58 was different from arriving at 8, and she wanted him to know that she was aware of the difference. His assistant, a young man named Porter, who had always been professionally neutral toward Emily, told her to go in. Langford was behind his desk. Heron was in the chair to the left. This surprised her. Not Heron's presence, which she had half expected, but his position in the room, which was not beside Langford in the configuration of an ally but slightly apart, the seating of someone who was present but had not yet declared which direction they were facing. There was a third person in the room. He was in his 40s, compact build, a gray blazer over a white shirt, no tie, the kind of professional appearance that was carefully calibrated to be unreadable. He had a folder on his knee. He was not hospital staff. Sit down, Carter, Langford said. She sat. She looked at the third person. Who is this? Mr. Travers is from the board's legal office, Langford said. He's here to document this conversation. Document it for what purpose? For the record, Travers said. His voice was the voice of someone who had spent years making himself unflappable, and had largely succeeded. This is a preliminary conversation prior to Friday's review. Nothing said here is binding, but it will be included in the board's materials. Emily looked at Langford. You should have told me legal would be present. I would have. This isn't an adversarial proceeding, Langford said, and the words came out smoothly, the words of someone who had prepared them. This is a conversation. Conversations with legal documentation are adversarial proceedings with better manners, Emily said. I'd like to request that Brenda Solis be present. Langford paused. That's not... I'll call her, Heron said from his chair. The room went still. Heron was already reaching for his phone. Langford looked at Heron with an expression that lasted exactly 1 second before he controlled it, but Emily caught it. The fractional recalibration of a man who had walked into this room with a specific arrangement and was watching it shift. Fine, Langford said. We'll wait for Solis. They waited 8 minutes. Brenda arrived with her own folder and the expression of someone who had been expecting a call and had already prepared for it. She took the remaining chair and looked at Emily with a brief nod. Now, Langford said, let's be straightforward. Carter, this review is about a pattern of conduct that culminated in... I'd like to ask a question first, Brenda said. Victor, has the hospital received any communication from Admiral Daniel Cross in the last 12 hours regarding this patient case and this staff member? The pause was brief. That's not relevant to... It's relevant to the context of this conversation, Brenda said, which is documented. So I want it on the record. Has the hospital received communication from Admiral Cross? Another pause. Langford looked at Travers. Travers looked at his folder. The board chair received a call, Travers said, neutrally, at approximately 5:30 this morning. Thank you, Brenda said. She sat back. Emily watched Langford's face run through the calculations. She had seen this process before, but not in hospitals, in other institutions with other hierarchies, and the math was always the same. Position A was defensible at cost X, but when the cost calculation changed, position A had to be reassessed. The question was whether Langford would reassess in the room, which required a specific kind of flexibility, or whether he would hold and absorb the cost later, which required a specific kind of stubbornness. She watched him choose. He opened his mouth, and then his desk phone rang. He looked at it. He reached for it. His assistant's voice came through. "I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a call from the board chair's office. They say it's urgent." Langford picked up the phone. He listened. His face moved through 3 distinct phases in approximately 40 seconds, and Emily watched all 3. The first was controlled attention, the second was something she would have called recalibration, and the third was the expression of a man who had just understood that the terrain had changed under him while he was standing on it. He put the phone down. He looked at the room. He looked at Emily. He said, "The board wants to move the review to this morning, 10 o'clock, all parties." He paused. "Including Admiral Cross." Travers made a note. Brenda looked at Emily. Emily said nothing. She looked at Langford's face, which was doing the work of a man who had built something over time and was now watching the ground floor develop cracks. And she felt, not satisfaction, not yet, because the board meeting hadn't happened, and she did not assume outcomes before they arrived, but a specific clarity, the kind of clarity that came when the variables of a situation became visible, when the picture was showing itself. Heron stood up. He said to Emily quietly enough that it wasn't for the room. "For what it's worth, I should have pushed back on the imaging protocol 3 weeks ago, when Hale was first admitted for the initial evaluation." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't, because it would have required overruling the admitting team, and I chose not to make the effort." A pause. "The fragment was visible in the original scan if you knew where to look. You knew where to look. I didn't look." Emily said, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because it'll come up in the board meeting, and I'd rather you heard it from me first." She looked at him. "Are you putting that in writing?" He held her gaze. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then I'll see you at 10. She walked out of the office and down the corridor and into the stairwell, where she stood on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors with her back against the wall and breathed. Deliberately, slowly, the conscious breath of someone giving their nervous system accurate information about the current state of threat, which was lowered, not gone. The board meeting was at 10. Cross would be there. Heron had committed to a written statement. Fenn's commendation was in Brenda's file. It was not over. She did not let herself believe it was over. But the ground had shifted, and she had not been the one to move it. She had simply stayed in place while the things she had done accurately, one decision at a time, accumulated into a record that was harder to dismiss than one person's opinion of who she was and where she belonged. She pushed off the wall. She had 3 hours before 10 o'clock, and she needed to check on her patients, change into spare scrubs from her locker, and eat something, in that order, because she was not going to walk into a board meeting that would determine the next phase of her life running on 17-plus hours of empty. She was on the 3rd floor landing when her pager went off again, not her phone. Her pager, the one tied to the floor alert system, the one that only carried specific categories of message. She looked at the code. Her stomach dropped. It was not Marcus. Marcus was in recovery, stable, monitored. It was a different room number, a different wing, and the code was not cardiac, not respiratory, not the standard clinical emergencies she triaged daily. It was the code for a security event, and the room number was the consultation room where she had left Ethan 45 minutes ago with a ward aide and a tablet, and the understanding that she would be back. She was already running. She hit the 3rd floor at full speed, and the ward aide, a young woman named Priya, who had been on the day shift rotation, was standing outside the consultation room door with her hands pressed over her mouth and the expression of someone who had encountered something she had no framework for. "What happened?" Emily said. "He's gone," Priya said. "I was there. I was right there. And someone came to the door, said they were from patient services, had an ID badge. I stepped out for 30 seconds to check, and when I came back..." Emily pushed the door open. The room was empty. The tablet was on the floor. The shark hoodie was on the couch. Ethan was gone. The shark hoodie was still warm. Emily registered that detail the way she registered all details. Fast, without commentary, filed and used immediately. The tablet on the floor had not been thrown. It had been placed there, or knocked off the table edge in the process of movement, not impact. The chair by the window was pushed back at an angle that suggested someone had stood up from it quickly. The door to the consultation room opened inward, which meant whoever had come to it had stood in the frame, not entered fully, which meant Priya stepping into the hallway to check credentials had been the intended geometry. Not opportunism, but design. Someone had known the layout of this room. The ID badge, Emily said. What did it look like? Priya's hands were shaking. Blue lanyard. It had the Ravenwood logo, Patient Services. It said Patient Services in the corner. Did it have a photo? Yes, I looked at it. I did look at it. Man, 40-something, dark hair. She stopped. I didn't look long enough. That's not your fault, Emily said, because it wasn't and because Priya needed to stay functional right now. I need you to call security and tell them exactly what you told me. Don't minimize any detail. Don't fill in gaps. Only what you actually saw. Can you do that? Yes. Now. Priya moved. Emily was already in the hallway, looking in both directions with the particular quality of attention that was not panic but its opposite. Everything slowed, clarified, the noise of the ward falling into background because her brain had prioritized the relevant inputs and was processing only those. Ethan was deaf. He could not hear someone calling his name from a distance. He could not have been lured with sound. He would have had to have been shown something, a note, a phone screen, a sign. He was 8 years old and he had his father's instincts for reading people, but he was still 8 years old, and whatever had been shown to him would have had to be credible. Something that referenced his father, probably. Something that made leaving seem reasonable rather than alarming. She pulled her phone and called the number Marcus had texted from the night before. It rang 3 times. He was in recovery. He might not have his phone, the nurses might have it. And then he picked up. Ethan's not in the consultation room, she said. Someone came to the door with a fake patient services ID, the aide stepped out, and he's gone. I need you to tell me, is there anyone, family, your ex-wife, anyone who would have come here without telling you? The silence lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she heard him process it the way trained people processed it. Not denial, not panic, the immediate practical inventory. His mother is in Seattle. She doesn't have the resources to get here overnight. My sister is in Raleigh. She doesn't know which hospital. There's nobody. No one from your unit? Someone who might have wanted to... No, nobody would come for Ethan without contacting me first. Nobody legitimate. Another 2 seconds. What's your security response time? I've initiated it. Stay in your room. I'll update you. Carter, stay in your room, Marcus. You have a repaired artery, and you have been awake for less than 2 hours post-surgery. I will find him. She ended the call before he could respond because he was going to try to get out of bed, and the worst thing that could happen right now was Marcus Hale pulling out his own IV lines in a recovery bay while his son was missing somewhere in a 7-story hospital. The security desk picked up on the first ring. She gave them Ethan's description. Gray hoodie? No, he'd left the hoodie, so whatever he was wearing underneath it, she didn't know. She should have known. She filed that as a failure and kept moving. Dark hair, 8 years old, deaf, 4'3" approximately. Last seen in the 4th floor consultation room at approximately 7:40. She told them about the fake badge. She told them to check every exit with camera coverage before they checked anything else. Because if Ethan had already left the building, the geometry of this changed entirely. Then she went to find Admiral Cross. He was in the main corridor on the 2nd floor, heading toward the elevator, phone already to his ear, which meant he'd heard. Either the security page or someone had called him. He saw her coming and lowered the phone. I know, he said. Do you? She stopped in front of him. Because I need to understand something right now. The timing on this? A child goes missing 2 hours before a board meeting that was moved up this morning, after a call from your office to the board chair. If someone knew that call was coming and knew what it meant for Langford's position. You think Langford took the child? Cross said it flatly, not as an accusation, but as a hypothesis he was already running. I think someone with access to this hospital's layout and staff ID systems used a credible badge to remove a vulnerable witness from a controlled space. And I think the timing is not a coincidence. She looked at him. Who knew about the 10 o'clock meeting before 8 this morning? Cross was quiet for 3 seconds. The board chair. His assistant. Langford. He was told in the call. Travers from legal. Solis. He paused. And anyone they told. I need the security footage from the fourth floor consultation room corridor. Right now, not through the hospital's normal request process. Can you make that happen? Cross looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize. The recalibration, the reassessment of who she was relative to who he'd been told she was, or who he'd expected her to be based on the file in the 11 years and the casualty report, and all the bureaucratic sediment that had accumulated on top of the actual person. He made a call. He spoke for 90 seconds. He lowered the phone. They're pulling it now. Security conference room, first floor. She was already walking. The security office at Ravenwood occupied a converted storage room near the loading dock, which had the practical effect of making it feel provisional, even though it had been there for 12 years. 2 monitors ran continuous feed. A guard named Okafor, who had worked the overnight and was technically 40 minutes past the end of his shift, pulled up the 4th floor corridor feed without being asked twice. 7:30 to 8, corridor outside consultation room 412, Emily said. The footage was the grainy, time-stamped quality of institutional cameras. Not useless, but requiring patience. They ran it at 1.5 speed. At 7:41, a figure in a gray blazer approached the consultation room door. Medium height, dark hair, the ID badge clearly displayed on a blue lanyard. The figure knocked, spoke briefly to Priya through the door, and held up the badge at a distance that was close enough to appear legitimate and far enough to prevent detailed examination. A practiced distance. Priya stepped out. The figure stepped in. 31 seconds later, the figure stepped back out, with Ethan beside him. Ethan was not being held. He was not distressed. He was looking up at the figure and his hands were moving. He was signing. He had been shown something that made him cooperative, something about his father. They moved toward the elevator. The figure pressed the down button. Floor 2, Emily said to Okafor. Camera near the elevator bank. He switched feeds. Floor 2, elevator lobby. They came out and turned immediately right, toward the administrative wing, not toward any patient area or exit. The figure said something that Emily couldn't lip read from this angle. Ethan's hands moved again. They turned a corner and the floor 2 camera lost them. Administrative wing has 1 camera, Okafor said. End of the corridor. He pulled it up. The corridor was empty. She looked at the timestamp. 8 seconds after the floor 2 elevator camera had lost them. The administrative corridor camera showed nothing. They had turned into a space between the 2 cameras, an office, a conference room, a supply closet. There were 11 rooms in that stretch of corridor. Emily knew because she had walked it twice, noting the layout, in the week after she'd started at Ravenwood, because she noted layouts. Always had. I need the room assignments for every space in the administrative corridor between the elevator and the end camera, she said. Okafor pulled up the building schematic. She read it in 6 seconds. Conference room A. Conference room B. Where last night's meeting had been held. 3 private offices. A document storage room. 2 staff bathrooms. The AV equipment closet. And at the far end, past the end camera's view, a secondary stairwell that connected the administrative wing to the loading dock level. The loading dock. She looked at Cross. He was already on his phone. She left the security office at a pace that was not quite running. Running in a hospital created problems, alarmed patients, required explanations, but was the fastest version of not running she could manage, which was considerably faster than most people's running. She took the stairs to the loading dock level in 11 seconds and pushed through the service door into the receiving area. The loading dock was a concrete platform with 3 bays, currently empty of trucks, the morning delivery window having closed at 7. The dock overlooked a service road that ran behind the hospital and connected to the main parking structure on one end and the street on the other. The air smelled like exhaust and the particular industrial cold of concrete that didn't get sunlight. A car was parked in the service road. It had been there for a while, long enough to have a parking ticket on the windshield from the overnight restriction. It was a dark sedan, nondescript, the kind of car chosen specifically to be unremarkable. The engine was running. In the back seat, visible through the rear window from where Emily stood on the dock, was a small, dark-haired figure. She did not run toward the car. She stood on the dock and looked at the situation with the whole frame attention that had been trained into her and had survived the TBI and the years and everything else, because some things became structural rather than practiced, and this was one of them. Running at the car would spook the driver. The driver, the figure in the gray blazer, she assumed, appeared to be on a phone in the front seat, head turned slightly toward the passenger window, not watching the dock. The car's locks were down. She could see the lock mechanism on the rear door from here, just barely. Ethan was in the back seat. He was not moving dramatically. He was sitting. His hands were in his lap. She looked at the service road. One end connected to the parking structure, which had two exits. The other end connected to the street, which was one way heading east. If the car moved, it had two options, and she was standing between neither of them. She stepped off the dock onto the service road, and she walked, not toward the car's driver's side, but around the rear, approaching the passenger side, staying in the blind spot created by the angle of the driver's mirror. She had covered 3/4 of the distance when Ethan turned his head and looked directly at her through the rear window. She signed, keeping her hands close to her body, small movements. Stay still. Don't react. It's okay. Ethan's face did not change. He was remarkable, this child. He looked back at the front seat. He did not react. The driver, she could see him clearly now through the side window, was a man she recognized, not from the security footage, not from the hospital staff, but from Langford's office. She had seen him twice in passing, once leaving Langford's office 3 weeks ago when she'd gone to deliver a patient safety report, and once in the parking lot in a context she hadn't assigned significance to at the time. He was one of Langford's administrative staff, not patient services, never patient services. Operations. His name was Garrett. She remembered it from the staff directory she'd reviewed when she'd first started, because she reviewed staff directories, because she noted names. She reached the rear passenger door. She tried the handle, locked, as expected. She knocked on the window. 2 short knocks, not urgent, the knock of someone who had every reason to be there. Garrett turned his head, saw her. The calculation that crossed his face happened in under a second. She watched it, the assess, the freeze, the decision. And she could see him calculating whether starting the car was faster than what was happening, whether he had a play that she hadn't anticipated, whether there was a version of this where he was not in the position he was now recognizably in. She looked at him through the glass, and she said calmly enough that he could read her lips, even if he couldn't hear her, "Turn the engine off." He turned the engine off, which surprised her slightly. Not the decision, but the speed of it. Something in his face had collapsed, the particular collapse of someone whose play had depended on not being caught before a specific moment and had now been caught before it. She heard footsteps behind her, cross, and with him one of the security guards, and from the far end of the service road, a second guard coming from the parking structure side. Cross had covered the exits. He had done it without being asked, because he had been doing this kind of thinking for 4 decades and didn't need instruction. She knocked on the window again. Garrett unlocked the doors. She opened the rear door. Ethan looked at her. She signed, "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. Then, he showed me a note. It said my dad needed me to go with him to another room. I know. It wasn't true. Your dad is fine. Come on. Ethan slid out of the car. He stood on the service road in whatever he'd been wearing under the hoodie, a long-sleeved shirt with a faded logo, jeans, and looked up at her with the expression of a child who was past being frightened and had arrived at something quieter and harder and more durable than fright. She put her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. Cross was already on the phone, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone coordinating multiple things simultaneously. The security guard had Garrett out of the car and was running through the procedural language of detainment with the flat efficiency of someone who did this rarely and was determined to do it correctly. Garrett was not resisting. He was not speaking. He had the look of a man who had understood, somewhere in the last 2 minutes, that the thing he'd been part of was larger than he'd been told it was, and that being told it was smaller did not change what it was. Emily walked Ethan back to the loading dock entrance. She signed, "I'm going to take you to see your dad now." Ethan looked up at her. Then, "Was that man going to hurt me?" She thought about the honest answer and the useful answer, and whether they were the same. "I don't think so," she signed. "I think he was trying to make something complicated for other people. But it doesn't matter now." Ethan considered this. Then, "The man with the dark suit, the older one. He helped?" "He did." "Is he good?" She paused. "He's trying to be." Ethan seemed to find this a more credible endorsement than a simple yes. The next 40 minutes were the particular controlled intensity of aftermath. The statements, the documentation, the security protocols that required specific language and specific order, and no shortcuts even when shortcuts would have been faster. Emily gave her statement twice, first to the Ravenwood security supervisor, and second to a Charleston PD officer who arrived at 8:40 with the particular expression of someone who had been called to a hospital for a child situation and was relieved to find the child physically unharmed. Cross gave his statement. Priya gave hers, shaking throughout but accurate, which was what mattered. Garrett said nothing beyond his name and asked for a lawyer at the second question, which was itself information. At 9:15, Brenda Solis appeared at Emily's elbow in the hallway outside the security office and said, in a voice that carried the specific weight of news that had been accumulating while other things were happening, "Victor Langford is not in the building." Emily looked at her. "He was here at 8, Brenda said. "He left the administrative wing at 8:20. His car has gone from the parking structure. He has not answered his phone in the last 45 minutes. Emily said, "The board meeting is at 10. "I'm aware." "Is the board chair aware he's gone?" "The board chair," Brenda said carefully, "received a second call this morning, at 8:35, from Garrett's work phone before Garrett was detained. The call was to Langford's direct office line and was not answered. The board chair's assistant logged it and flagged it." She paused. "The board chair is already in the building. He arrived at 8:50. He's been in conference with 2 board members since." Emily processed this. "What did Cross tell the board chair last night?" "I don't know the specifics. What I know is that Admiral Cross apparently provided documentation." Brenda looked at her with the expression of someone choosing their words with the precision of a person who understood that they were being recorded by her, that she was paying attention to every syllable. "Documentation relating to your service record, the circumstances of your medical discharge, and what Cross described as a systematic failure of duty of care in this hospital's ADA compliance infrastructure that he had become aware of in the course of the last 24 hours. The ADA compliance, the interpreter services, the family waiting rooms with no relay access. The deaf child left in a corridor for 3 days because nobody had checked whether there was any system to communicate with him. She had filed a memo about it yesterday at 5 p.m. She had cited the hospital's own compliance documentation. She had been thinking of it as a patient care issue because it was a patient care issue. But it was also, she now understood, a different kind of issue. The kind with legal exposure attached to it. The kind that board members noticed. The kind that made administrators' positions uncomfortable in ways that pure clinical disputes did not. "Is there a formal compliance review?" Emily said. "There will be." Brenda's voice was flat. "By the end of today, I expect." Ethan was in Marcus's recovery room at 9:30. Emily walked him there herself, and when she opened the door and Ethan saw his father, propped up in the bed, pale, the right arm in a proper brace now, the monitors doing their steady work, the child crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped at the bed rail with the abrupt halt of someone who had wanted to throw himself at another person and had remembered at the last second that the other person had a repaired blood vessel. Marcus looked at his son. His face did the thing that faces did when they were off guard, unmanaged, unperformed, the actual expression of the actual feeling. He reached out his left hand and put it on Ethan's head, and Ethan leaned into it, and neither of them signed anything for a moment. Emily stood in the doorway. Marcus looked at her over Ethan's head. His expression was the one she had seen last night in the OR corridor, the across-the-room look, the confirmation that someone was still there. She held it for a second and then looked at the monitors because his numbers were what they needed to be, and she allowed herself 1 second of letting that matter. "Ethan's okay," she said. "Physically, he's fine. He's going to need to talk to someone, a professional, about what happened. I can get you a referral." "I know someone," Marcus said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia. "Good one. Works with military kids." He paused. "Was it Langford?" "Someone who worked for Langford. We don't have the full picture yet." "But Langford knew." She looked at him. "That's what the investigation will determine." "Carter." "Yes?" "Probably." "Yes." Marcus was quiet. He looked at the window, then back at her. "The board meeting's at 10. "I know." "Go." He signed to Ethan. "Stay with me for a little while?" Ethan signed back, obviously. Something close to a smile crossed Marcus's face. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who had been through enough in the past 48 hours to have earned a more complicated version of tired than the ordinary kind. But it was real. Emily left. The boardroom at Ravenwood was on the 6th floor, which was architecturally the building's most recently renovated section, and showed it: clean lines, better lighting, the kind of conference table that announced institutional seriousness. She arrived at 9:54, which was 6 minutes before the meeting, which was not early enough to suggest nervousness and not late enough to suggest anything else. Brenda was already there. Cross was there, in the same dark suit, looking like he had not slept, which was consistent with the evidence. Heron was there with a printed document in front of him. His written statement, she assumed. Travers from legal was there. 2 board members she knew by name and not by face, and one she recognized from a hospital gala photograph in the lobby. The board chair, Gerald Osei, 63, former hospital administrator turned governance professional, the kind of man who had spent 20 years cleaning up other people's institutional messes and wore the experience in his posture. Langford was not there. Osei opened the meeting at exactly 10 o'clock with the precision of someone for whom punctuality was a value, not a habit. He said, "We're aware that one of the parties to this meeting is absent. We're proceeding regardless. The events of the past 14 hours have made a number of things clear that require formal address, and we're not going to wait on the convenience of the individual whose conduct is most centrally at issue." Emily noted the word conduct, not decision or policy or administrative approach. Conduct. Osei looked at Heron first. "Dr. Heron, your written statement." Heron slid the document across the table. "I've stated the clinical facts in detail. The medication order I issued would have caused a fatal vascular event given the patient's undocumented metallic foreign body. The order was flagged by charge nurse Carter through proper escalation channels within the time frame allowed by the patient safety protocol. The flag was clinically correct. I should have identified the foreign body in the initial imaging review, and I did not. That is documented in my statement." Osei nodded, looked at Emily. "Ms. Carter." She had prepared nothing written. She spoke. She was precise, and she was brief, and she covered the clinical timeline, the flag, the code blue, the vascular consult, the surgery, and the outcome. She did not editorialize. She did not use the word vindicated or anything adjacent to it, because the facts were the facts, and they did not require editorial. Then Osei looked at Cross. Cross spoke for 11 minutes. He covered Emily's service record, not the classified details, but the structure of it, the EOD qualification, the combat medic secondary, the operation, the TBI, the medical discharge, the correction to the casualty report that had sat unread in an archive for 11 years. He spoke about the nature of the documentation error and the institutional failure that had allowed it to persist. He spoke about what he had witnessed in the last 24 hours, in room 412, in the hallway, in the way a charge nurse had identified a vascular emergency that 2 physicians had missed, and had navigated the institutional resistance to her assessment with what he described as, and he paused before the phrase, combat-level composure under administrative fire. The room was quiet when he finished. One of the board members, a woman in her 50s named Aldridge, said, "The interpreter services deficiency, the ADA compliance issue." "Yes," Osei said. He had a folder in front of him. "We have Nurse Carter's memo from yesterday evening citing specific gaps in the hospital's compliance with federal deaf and hard-of-hearing patient communication requirements. We have a patient case, Ethan Hale, 8 years old, deaf, who was left in a public corridor without any communication access for an extended period. We have documentation that the interpreter services budget line was reduced by 40% in last year's administrative restructuring." He looked at the folder. "That restructuring was authorized by the administrator." Aldridge said, "And the child this morning, the detainment." "Charleston PD is handling that as a potential custodial interference matter pending investigation," Travers said. "The hospital's legal exposure will depend on what the investigation determines about institutional knowledge and authorization." "By institutional knowledge," Aldridge said carefully, "you mean whether Langford knew and directed it?" "Correct." The room absorbed this. Osei looked at Emily. "Ms. Carter, are you aware that Victor Langford has not reported to the building today and has been unreachable since approximately 8:20 this morning?" "I was told," Emily said. Do you have any information about his whereabouts or intentions? No. Osei nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. The looking at the table gesture that she had learned in the context of people like Osei meant decision, not evasion. Then he looked up. The board is placing Victor Langford on administrative leave effective immediately pending the outcome of the compliance review, the PD investigation, and an internal audit of administrative decisions over the past 18 months. Brenda Solis will serve as interim administrator. He looked at Brenda. Effective today. Brenda received this with the nod of someone who had been carrying more than her job description for longer than her job description acknowledged. Osei looked at Emily. Ms. Carter, the protocol review that was initiated against you is suspended. The board's position is that your actions were clinically justified and procedurally appropriate. We will be conducting a review of the patient safety escalation protocols to determine whether the current procedures provide adequate protection for clinical staff who identify physician-level errors. He paused. In other words, we will be examining whether the system as designed allowed a charge nurse to do the right thing or required her to do the right thing despite the system. That distinction matters. Emily said nothing for a moment. Then, thank you. It was not enough, as expressions went. It was what she had. The meeting wrapped in another 20 minutes. The procedural language, the next steps, the documentation of the documentation. Emily signed what needed to be signed, said what needed to be said, and when the room began to empty, she remained in her chair for a moment. Not from tiredness, but from the specific requirement of the moment. The need to let the last 48 hours settle into something she could carry accurately, without distortion in either direction. Brenda paused beside her chair on the way out. Take a day, she said. You're not on shift until Thursday. Take Tuesday and Wednesday and actually use them. There are patients. There are other nurses. You've been awake for what, 26 hours? About that. Take the days. Brenda put her hand on Emily's shoulder briefly. The contact of a person who understood when gesture was more useful than language. And then she left. Cross was the last one out. He stopped at the door. The archive, he said. Your service record. I'm initiating a formal review to have the casualty report corrected in the active system, not just the archive. He looked at her. It should have been done 11 years ago. I'm doing it now. She looked at the table. All right. There's also a commendation from the operation. It was never filed correctly because of the documentation error. It exists. I've seen it, but it's buried. I'm going to surface it. She looked up. I don't need a commendation. No, he said. But the record needs to be accurate. Records matter. He paused. You know that better than anyone. She held his gaze. Don't do it for me. Do it because the record is wrong, and wrong records cause the same problems 11 years from now that they caused 11 years ago. He nodded. Fair enough. He left. She sat alone in the boardroom for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. She counted, because she counted things. The small private calibrations. And then she stood up and walked out. She went back to the 4th floor. She checked Marcus's chart. She checked the step-down criteria and confirmed he was tracking to move by noon. She looked in on 2 other patients from her regular rotation, checked their readings, noted what needed noting. She did her job, because her job was what she was there to do, and the boardroom and the service road and the 11 years and the operation that nobody was supposed to know about were all real. But so was room 407, where a 60-year-old man with a knee replacement was running a low-grade fever that needed monitoring. She was at the nurse's station at 11:15, updating the chart, when Dennis appeared. You should go home, he said. I'm finishing the chart. The chart will survive without you for 14 hours. Probably. She kept writing. Dennis stood there for a moment with the comfortable presence of a person who had decided to simply exist nearby until she was done, and she found she didn't mind it. When she set the pen down, he said, Priya wanted me to tell you she's sorry about Ethan. Tell her it wasn't her fault. I did. She wanted to hear it from you. Emily looked at the wall, then she looked at Dennis. I'll talk to her before I leave. Good. A pause. Carter. What's going to happen to Langford? She thought about it. Langford, in his car, driving away from a building where the things he'd constructed were coming down at a rate he couldn't outpace. The compliance review, the PD investigation, the administrative audit, the board's decision. Garrett, who had a lawyer and was going to say something eventually, because people in Garrett's position always said something eventually, because the alternative was absorbing the full weight of it alone, and almost no one was built for that. Consequences, she said. Real ones. Dennis nodded slowly. About time. She finished the chart. She talked to Priya. She went to her locker and retrieved her jacket and her keys and her bag, which had been sitting there since 6 in the morning when she'd arrived, thinking she was going to change into clean scrubs and eat something and prepare for a board meeting, which had turned into something considerably different. She was at the elevator when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Marcus. Ethan wants to know if you'll come back tomorrow. She stared at the message. Then she typed, I'm off shift until Thursday. 3 seconds. That's not a no. She pressed the elevator button. She looked at the message for a moment longer than she needed to. She typed, I'll come back tomorrow. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. She was halfway to the ground floor when the elevator stopped unexpectedly at the 3rd floor and the doors opened. And standing there, not waiting for the elevator, clearly, because he hadn't pressed the button, and he looked as surprised to see her as she was to see him, was Heron. He had his coat on. He was leaving too, by the look of it. He looked at her in the elevator, and she looked at him in the hallway, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he said, For what it's worth, the commendation cross mentioned, from the operation. He paused. I looked up what I could find, the redacted version. What you did, the secondary device, the extraction conditions. He stopped again, and she could see him doing the thing that precise men did when they were trying to be accurate about something that did not fit inside clinical language. I've been a physician for 22 years. I don't say this about many people. She waited. You should not be a charge nurse, he said. The words landed in a specific way, not the way they would have landed from Langford, not dismissal, not diminishment, something else entirely. She looked at him and saw what he meant and felt the complicated weight of it. I am a nurse, she said. That's not a lesser thing. No, he said. It isn't. I said it wrong. He looked at the floor, the tell she had catalogued earlier, the real tell, the cost. I meant, you should be leading something, a program, a unit, something that uses what you are. He looked up. The board is going to have vacancies in the clinical oversight structure. After today, I intend to recommend you for consideration. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Heron, who had dismissed her flag in a second-floor corridor and then written the statement that helped correct the course. Harmon, who had arrived too late and too slowly and had arrived nonetheless. People were people. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He stepped aside from the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. She was standing in the hospital lobby, jacket on, bag over her shoulder, 14 seconds from the front door in the parking lot, and the drive home. And the first real sleep she'd had in over 24 hours when she stopped. She stopped because she had seen something. At the edge of the lobby, near the information desk, in the shadow of the mural she had walked past 413 times. A man she did not recognize. 50s, civilian clothes, nothing remarkable. He was looking at his phone, except he wasn't. His eyes were on her. The phone was a prop. She had been trained to notice when she was being watched. She had never fully untrained it. She held still. She ran the variables. Cross had left the building. Langford was gone. Garrett was in custody. The board meeting was over. There was no angle she could immediately identify, no active situation that would have produced a watcher in the lobby at 11:30 in the morning. But he was watching her, and on the lapel of his jacket, barely visible, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it, if you hadn't spent years learning to look for exactly that kind of small institutional identifier, was a pin she recognized. Not Ravenwood, not hospital staff, not military either. The pin was from a federal oversight body that had no official reason to be in this building, that did not coordinate with hospital administrations or military liaisons through normal channels, that operated in the specific category of investigations that involved classified personnel records and documentation errors that had persisted for 11 years in archives that nobody was supposed to be looking at. The man looked at his phone again. Then he looked up at her. He said nothing. He didn't move. He just held her gaze with the patient, specific quality of someone who had been waiting and was now communicating, without language, that the waiting was over. Emily stood in the lobby of Ravenwood Military Medical Center and understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose training had never fully left her, that the correction cross had promised to her service record, the one that would surface the operation, the commendation, the real version of what had happened 11 years ago, had already begun to move through systems that were larger than Cross, larger than the board, larger than anything that had happened in this hospital in the last 48 hours. And that whoever this man was, and whoever had sent him, and whatever they wanted from the person they had spent 11 years believing was dead, they had found her. She did not look away from him. That was the first decision, made in the first second, and it was the right one because looking away was information. It told the watcher that she was rattled, that the recognition had landed as a threat, that she was calculating an exit. She was calculating things, but she was not rattled, and she did not intend to give him the distinction. She crossed the lobby toward him. He didn't move. He watched her come with the stillness of someone who had expected this response and had prepared for it, which told her something about how he'd assessed her, which told her something about what he already knew. She covered the distance in 12 steps, stopped 2 feet in front of him, and looked at the pin on his lapel at close range. Up close, it was unambiguous. A small enamel oval in navy and silver, the identifier of the Defense Investigative Services Civilian Oversight Branch, the office that handled exactly the category of thing that Cross had described that morning. Classified personnel records, documentation corrections, cases where the gap between what the record said and what had actually happened had legal and institutional consequence. "You've been here a while," she said. Not a question. She had not seen him earlier, but that meant nothing. She had been in a security office, a boardroom, a recovery room, a service road. He had been in a lobby with a prop phone and patients. "Since 7, he said. His name, she would learn, was Reeves. He said it without being asked, which was either confidence or courtesy, possibly both. "We knew about the board meeting. We wanted to observe the outcome before making contact." "We?" "My office. We've been monitoring the correction request Admiral Cross filed this morning." She looked at him. "He filed it this morning, and your office is already here." "The correction triggered an automatic flag," Reeves said. "When a casualty record from a classified operation is corrected to living status after more than a decade, it generates a review process. That process began the moment Cross submitted the paperwork." He paused. "We're not here to cause problems for you, Ms. Carter. We're here because the process requires a conversation, and the conversation needs to happen in person." She looked at him for a long moment. The lobby moved around them. A family with balloons heading toward the elevator, a nurse on a phone call, the information desk volunteer handing someone a visitor badge. Ordinary hospital morning, ordinary human traffic, and in the middle of it a conversation about 11 years of institutional silence being formally ended. "Where?" she said. "Wherever you're comfortable. We can use the hospital's facilities or go somewhere outside." "Outside," she said. She did not want this conversation inside Ravenwood. She had had enough conversations inside Ravenwood in the last 48 hours to last a significant portion of a lifetime. They walked out through the main entrance into the Charleston morning, which had moved past the provisional gray-pink of 6 a.m. into a harder, clearer light. The air was cool and smelled like the harbor. Salt and distance and the specific quality of coastal air that always struck her, still, after 2 years, as something you could lean against. They found a bench on the far side of the main entrance plaza, away from the ambulance bay and the shuttle bus stop, and she sat down, and he sat down, and she waited. Reeves had a tablet. He did not open it immediately. He was the kind of person who had learned that leading with a device before establishing the human register of a conversation was a mistake, which suggested he had made that mistake before and had learned from it. "The official correction to your record," he said, "will take approximately 72 hours to process through the system. At the end of that process, your status in the military personnel database will reflect accurately, medically discharged, living, and based on the commendation documentation that Admiral Cross has also submitted, the recipient of a Distinguished Service Medal from Operation Coldwater Ridge." He paused. "That medal was approved 11 years ago. It was never conferred because the recipient was listed as deceased." Emily looked at the parking lot, at the cars arranged in their ordinary rows, at a sparrow doing something with a fast food wrapper near the handicapped space. "The medal doesn't change anything," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't. but the record being accurate changes some things. There are benefits you were entitled to during your recovery period that were not provided because your status was incorrect. Back payment processes exist for exactly this situation. They're slow, they're bureaucratic, they require documentation, but they're real. He paused again. There's also the matter of your formal separation package, which was processed under a casualty classification rather than a medical discharge classification. The difference, financially, is significant. She had not thought about the financial dimension. She thought about it now, briefly, and then set it aside for later because it was not the thing that mattered most in this moment, and she knew her own hierarchy. "What does your office need from me?" she said. "A signed statement confirming the events of the operation from your perspective. Not classified details. We have those from other sources. Your confirmation of your own actions, your status at the end of the extraction, the circumstances of the documentation error." He looked at her. "Your experience of the 11 years. How you were treated or not treated during the recovery period. Whether you received appropriate medical follow-up under the correct classification." He paused. "Basically, what happened to you?" She looked at the harbor sky above the roofline. "What happens with that statement?" "It becomes part of a systemic review. Your case is not the only one." He said it simply, without drama, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of weight. "Documentation errors of this kind, casualty misclassification, records that don't get corrected, people who fall out of the system and don't know how to get back in or make the calculation that the cost of getting back in is too high. It happens more than it should. Your statement contributes to a process that's trying to prevent the next one." She looked at him. "You're not just here about me." "We're here about you specifically," he said. "And yes, also about the pattern." She sat with that for a moment. The pattern. The next person who would fall out of a system that listed them incorrectly and spend 11 years building a parallel life, while the official version of them collected institutional dust. The next recovery that happened without support. The next gap between what the record said and what the person had actually lived. "I'll give you the statement," she said. "Give me 72 hours. Take the time you need." "I said 72 hours. She looked at him. "I don't need more than that." He nodded. He gave her a card, physical, which she appreciated for its specificity, its commitment to a fixed contact point. She put it in her jacket pocket. She stood up. "One more thing," Reeves said. She stopped. "The work you did here, in this hospital, in the last 2 days. It's going to be part of the record too." He said it without sentimentality, the way you stated operational facts. Admiral Cross was thorough. What you identified, what you flagged, how you navigated the resistance, it's documented. It will be read by people who make decisions about how clinical oversight works in military-affiliated medical facilities. He paused. "I thought you should know that. Not everything you do disappears." She looked at him. Something moved through her that was not quite any word she had. It was the feeling of something closing, not ending, closing, the distinction between a door swinging shut and a wound sealing, which were not the same thing but had the same sound if you weren't listening carefully. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. She walked back to her car. She sat in it for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then she drove home. The next 3 days happened. The way aftermath happened. Not in the cinematic sense, not in clean acts with clear transitions, but in the accumulated ordinariness of a life, resuming after it had been violently interrupted. She slept for 11 hours on Tuesday and woke up with the specific disorientation of too deep sleep, the body's overcompensation. She ate. She went for a walk along the harbor because movement helped her think, and the harbor had always helped her think, the way large bodies of water helped people who needed perspective on the scale of their own problems. She called her sister in Atlanta, which she did roughly every 3 weeks and had been putting off, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the hospital and some things that did. And her sister, who was 5 years older and had the particular exhaustion of someone who had been worried about Emily for a long time without having the right language to say so, said, near the end of the call, "You sound different." "Different how?" "I don't know. Less compressed." Emily thought about that. "Maybe," she said. She wrote the statement for Reeves on Wednesday. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and a second cup that went cold after it, and she wrote, She wrote the operation and the secondary device and the extraction and the field hospital and the TBI and the months afterward when she had not been entirely able to trust her own perception of the world, and the decision she had made, not once but dozens of times, to not go back. She wrote it without self-pity and without the opposite of self-pity, which was the performed stoicism that was its own form of dishonesty. She wrote it accurately, which was the only way she knew how to write anything. At the end, she wrote one paragraph that was not part of the official record, but that she included anyway, because Reeves had said the statement would contribute to preventing the next person from falling through the same gap, and she wanted whoever read it to understand something specific. She wrote, "The hardest part was not the recovery. The hardest part was the decision, made in the first weeks after the TBI, to accept the error in my record rather than fight it. That decision was made by a person who was still learning to trust her own brain again, who was physically and cognitively depleted, who had no institutional support because the institution believed her to be dead. I'm not making a case for my own weakness. I'm making a case for the recognition that people in medical crisis, including military personnel with serious traumatic injuries, cannot be expected to navigate complex bureaucratic corrections from inside the crisis. The system should not require them to. The fact that it does is the thing worth fixing." She sent it to Reeves at 11:14 on Wednesday night. He acknowledged receipt at 11:16, which confirmed he was not sleeping either, and sent 3 words back, "Thank you, received." She went to Ravenwood on Thursday. She arrived for her shift at the normal time and went to the normal locker room and changed into fresh scrubs and looked at herself in the mirror for approximately 2 seconds, which was her standard duration. She looked like someone who had slept and eaten and had slightly too much on her mind, which was accurate. The floor felt different on Thursday morning, and she was trying to understand why, for the first 20 minutes of her shift before she identified it, people looked at her differently. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories, where recognition arrived with ceremony and volume. The way it actually happened, which was smaller and more durable. A nod from a nurse she knew by face and schedule. Okafor from security, who was starting a day shift, holding the elevator door for her and saying, "Morning, Carter," with a quality in the 2 words that hadn't been there before. Dennis, at the nurse's station, who looked up when she arrived and said, "Brenda wants to see you when you get a minute. No urgency." She saw her patients first. 4 rooms, standard morning rounds, vitals, chart review, a conversation with a man named Patterson in room 408 about why he needed to stop trying to walk to the bathroom unassisted when the PT team had specifically documented fall risk. She was not warm in the performed sense. She was present and accurate, and when Patterson pushed back, she pushed back harder, which he seemed to find reassuring rather than off-putting, possibly because he was also former military and recognized the register. Brenda's office was on the 2nd floor now. She had taken the administrator's office, which was a practical decision about where the administration needed to be located, and also, Emily suspected, a statement of a different kind. The office had been reorganized already. Langford's framed commendations were gone from the wall, replaced by a whiteboard covered in Brenda's handwriting. Action items, timelines, the working language of someone who was running a thing rather than occupying a position. It looked more functional and less expensive than it had before. "Sit down," Brenda said. Emily sat. "Langford," Brenda said, without preamble. Charleston PD picked him up Tuesday night. He was at his brother's house in Columbia. He was charged Wednesday morning with 1 count of obstruction, 1 count of reckless endangerment for the situation with Ethan, and 3 counts of falsifying hospital compliance documentation. She looked at Emily. The compliance documentation was apparently a pattern going back 4 years. He had been submitting ADA compliance certifications that did not reflect the actual state of the hospital's interpreter services. The budget cuts were real. The certification said they weren't made. Emily said, "How many patients were affected?" "We don't have a full count yet. The audit is ongoing. We know of at least 14 cases in the last 2 years where deaf or hard of hearing patients received materially inadequate communication access. 2 of those cases involved treatment decisions made without the patient's fully informed consent because the communication failure meant they couldn't understand what they were agreeing to." Brenda's voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something with heat in it, the specific temperature of someone who had worked in patient care for a long time and understood what those 14 cases meant in human terms. He built something that looked correct from the outside. The paperwork was there. The certifications were there. The reality wasn't. Emily said nothing. Garrett, Brenda continued, is cooperating with the PD investigation. He's provided a statement confirming that Langford directed him to remove Ethan from the hospital. The framing was that Ethan was a liability witness if the board meeting became adversarial, and Langford wanted him out of the building before 10 o'clock. She paused. He didn't think it through beyond that. I don't think Langford did either. I think they thought if Ethan was gone and unreachable for a few hours, it disrupted the board meeting enough to give Langford room to manage the narrative. I don't think either of them fully processed what it meant to remove a deaf 8-year-old from a hospital without his parents' knowledge. They thought small, Emily said. They thought they were untouchable, Brenda said, which is a version of the same thing. She looked at her whiteboard. Heron has submitted a formal proposal to revise the initial imaging protocol for military admits with combat histories. Mandatory secondary vascular review for any patient with documented exposure to explosive events. It's going through clinical committee. She paused. He cited your clinical reasoning in the proposal, formally, by name. Emily looked at the window. The board, Brenda said, has approved the creation of a deaf and hard of hearing patient advocacy position. Full-time, clinical grade, reporting to nursing leadership. It includes an ASL interpreter on staff rotation and a patient communication protocol that's going to be written from scratch. She looked at Emily directly. They've asked me to recommend someone to lead the development of that protocol. Emily looked at her. I'm recommending you, Brenda said, not because you're the convenient choice, because you identified the gap before anyone else did, you documented it under pressure, and you have both the clinical background and the communication skills to build something that will actually work. She folded her hands on the desk. The position would be in addition to your charge nurse role for the first 6 months while the protocol is being built, and then transition to a hybrid clinical administrative role. Pay adjustment goes with it. She paused. It's not mandatory. You can say no. Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about Ethan in the hallway. She thought about the 14 cases she didn't yet know the names of, the 14 people who had sat in rooms and tried to understand what was happening to them and couldn't, because the system had been certified as functional when it wasn't. She thought about what Reeves had said. Not everything you do disappears. I'll do it, she said. Brenda nodded, the nod of someone who had expected this answer but had not assumed it. Good, I'll start the paperwork today. Emily stood. She was at the door when Brenda said, "One more thing." She stopped. She was getting used to one more things. They had become, in the last several days, the phrase that preceded the things that actually mattered. The patient in room 412, Brenda said. He's being moved to the veteran rehabilitation facility across town this afternoon. Standard step down from surgical recovery. His son is with him. She looked at Emily with the expression of a person who had noted something and was choosing whether to note it aloud. She chose. The boy asked the nursing staff 3 times this morning whether you were coming in today. Emily said, "I'll stop by before they transfer." She went back to her floor. She worked through the morning the way she always worked, fully, without half measures, because the work was real, and the people in the rooms were real, and the fact that other things were also real simultaneously was not a reason to be less present. She updated charts. She caught a medication timing issue in room 411 that would have been a problem in 3 hours, and wasn't because she caught it. She had a difficult conversation with a family in room 405 about a prognosis that the doctor had delivered with accuracy, but without adequate time for the family to process. And she sat with them for 12 minutes, and said the hard things again more slowly, and answered the questions the doctor hadn't had time for. At noon, she went to room 412. Marcus was sitting up, dressed, civilian clothes, which looked slightly surreal after days of seeing him in a hospital gown. The reality of him as a person who existed outside this building becoming suddenly concrete. The brace on his right arm was lighter than the post-surgical version. Ethan was on the window bench with the tablet, doing something that involved a lot of deliberate hand movements that she recognized as ASL practice, working through a vocabulary app with the focused seriousness of a child who had decided to improve. She knocked on the open door. Ethan looked up and signed immediately, before she was fully in the room. "You're here." "I'm here," she signed. "How's the vocabulary?" He held up the tablet. He had been working through the medical vocabulary section, hospital terms, body parts, procedural language. She looked at the word he was currently on, surgery. He He had gotten it right. Good, she signed. Marcus watched this exchange with the expression she was beginning to know as his resting state around her. Attentive, slightly careful, the look of someone who was still adjusting to the fact of her existence in a present tense rather than a past one. You look like you slept, he said. 11 hours. Good. He shifted his weight. They're transferring me at 2. I know. The rehab facility is good. I've had patients come back from it. The vascular recovery program is solid. How long? 4 to 6 weeks for full clearance. Depends on how your body responds and whether you do what the PT team tells you. I do what I'm told. She looked at him. He almost smiled. When it makes sense, he amended. She moved to the window side of the room and sat in the chair near Ethan, because Ethan had watched her come in and was now alternating his attention between her and the tablet with the air of someone waiting for a moment that hadn't arrived yet. He wants to ask you something, Marcus said. Ethan set the tablet down. He signed with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been composing this in their head for a while. When I come back, my dad has PT 4 times a week and I have school, but I have 2 days free. Can I practice signs with you? She looked at him. He was watching her with the same patience he'd shown in the hallway 3 days ago. The particular patience of a child who asked for real things rather than acceptable things, who had not yet learned to want less in advance of disappointment. Yes, she signed. 2 days a week. But you have to actually practice between sessions, or it's a waste of both our time. He signed back immediately, obviously. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. She stayed for 20 minutes. They talked, or communicated, the word talked being approximate, when the conversation happened in 2 modes simultaneously. Marcus signing slowly with his left hand while speaking, Ethan signing fluidly, and Emily signing back, the room finding its own rhythm. They talked about the rehabilitation facility, which was on the north side of town near the water, which Ethan had opinions about. They talked about Ethan's school, which had an interpreter but not a good one, which Emily had opinions about and expressed them in terms of what Ethan could ask for that were his rights under the law. They talked about Marcus's sister in Raleigh, who was driving down this weekend, and who Ethan referred to by a sign that appeared to mean the loud one, and which Marcus did not correct. When she stood to leave, Marcus stood too. A careful standing, the stand of a man who was remembering the new geography of his own body. He looked at her. The board meeting, he said. What happened? With all of it? Cross told me some of it last night. It worked out. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if you're okay. She looked at him. It was a specific question, asked specifically, and it deserved a specific answer. She gave it the thought it deserved. I've been carrying something for a long time, she said. I put some of it down this week. I don't know exactly what that feels like yet because it's only been a few days and the shape of what I was carrying is still, I can still feel where it was. She paused. But yes, I think so. He held her gaze. The record, he said. Cross told me it's being corrected. It is. The commendation. Yes. You should have had that 11 years ago. Yes, she said. I should have. I'm sorry I didn't look harder after the operation. I knew something didn't add up about the casualty report. I knew. He stopped. I had a newborn and a deployment rotation, and I told myself the military had handled it correctly. I didn't push. She looked at him. This was the second apology from a person who owed her something and was choosing to pay it. And like Cross's apology, it didn't reconstruct anything, couldn't, but it was real. And real things accumulated into the record of a life the same way inaccurate things did. You have a son who needed you, she said. You were there. That's not nothing. He looked at Ethan on the window bench, who was back on the tablet, but tracking the conversation the way he tracked most things. With peripheral attention that was actually total attention. No, Marcus said. It's not nothing. She left at 12:30 and finished her shift and did not count the tiles on the way out. The weeks that followed were not a straight line. She had not expected them to be. The protocol work was harder than she had anticipated and more interesting than she had anticipated, which were related facts. Building a communication framework for deaf and hard of hearing patients from institutional scratch meant understanding the specific ways the existing system had failed, not in the abstract, but in the particular, case by case, which meant reading 14 case files in her off hours and feeling the weight of each one as a distinct weight rather than a statistic. A 62-year-old man who had agreed to a procedure he didn't understand because the explanatory materials were audio only and no one had offered an alternative. A 17-year-old girl who had reported pain for 6 hours before anyone thought to ask her preferred communication mode. A 40-year-old woman who had left the hospital mid-treatment because the environment was so communicatively inaccessible that the stress of being there was worse than the condition that had brought her in. Emily read them all. She took notes. She built the protocol from the failures outward, not from a theory of what patients needed, but from the evidence of what had happened when they didn't get it. It was not elegant work. It was specific and unglamorous, and it required arguing with 3 department heads about budget lines and sitting through 4 committee meetings where the same objections came up in rotation and were answered, each time, with documentation. Heron sat on the clinical committee. He was not a simple person, and she had stopped expecting him to be. He pushed back on 2 elements of the protocol with objections that were legitimate. She revised them. He supported 6 elements that she had expected resistance on. He was the version of himself that he apparently was when the stakes were high enough to require it, which was not the version he'd been on the day she'd flagged his order, but it was the version that showed up to the committee table, and she worked with what showed up. The interpreter rotation was operational by week 6. The patient communication screening, a mandatory intake question about preferred communication mode, so simple it was almost insultingly obvious in retrospect, was embedded in the admissions protocol by week 8. The on-call ASL interpreter service, contracted with an external provider while the hospital worked toward a full-time hire, was live by week 10. She tested it herself, the first day it was live. She called the line, signed a scenario, and measured the response time, the accuracy, and the quality of the interpretation. It was adequate. She documented where it needed to be better. Adequate was not enough. She kept pushing. The federal review from Reeves's office completed in week 7. The findings were not public in their classified elements, but the institutional recommendations were a 40-page document that cited, among other things, the specific failures that had allowed Emily's casualty misclassification to persist for 11 years, and proposed systemic changes to the casualty record review process for classified operations. Reeves sent her a copy with a note. Your statement is referenced in Section 4. You don't need to read it unless you want to. She read it. Her statement was quoted in 2 places. The paragraph she had added at the end, the one about systems expecting crisis-depleted people to navigate complex corrections from inside the crisis, appeared in full in the recommendations section, attributed to a decorated veteran whose case prompted this review. She read it once. She closed the document. She put her laptop away and made dinner and watched television, which she rarely did, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, which she also rarely did. Langford's case moved through the legal system with the slowness that legal systems had when the evidence was substantial and the defendant's lawyers were trying to find angles that didn't exist. The obstruction charge was solid. The falsified compliance documentation was solid. The reckless endangerment charge, the one connected to Ethan, was the one that the lawyers contested most actively, and it was the one that Emily found she cared most about, not for punitive reasons, but because it was the charge that named accurately what had happened. A child had been endangered because a man had decided his institutional position was worth protecting at any cost, including the safety of an 8-year-old who couldn't speak for himself in a hearing-based system. Garrett pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in week 5 and received supervised probation, which was unsatisfying in the abstract and probably correct given his specific culpability. He had been used more than he had orchestrated. That didn't absolve him, but it was accurate. She attended none of the hearings. She had given her statements, and she was not going to spend her Thursdays in a courtroom watching institutional failure process itself through legal language. She had other things to do with her Thursdays, on Thursdays and on Mondays. Ethan came to the hospital. It was not official. She had not made it official, because official things required paperwork and categories, and the relationship between a charge nurse and a deaf 8-year-old did not fit the existing categories neatly. He came with his father during Marcus's PT sessions at the rehab facility, and then Marcus's sister drove him across town to Ravenwood, where he sat in the family consultation room, the same one he had been taken from, which was either ironic or fitting, and she had decided to treat it as fitting. And they practiced. She taught him medical signs first because she was a nurse, and because medical signs were precise, and precision was something Ethan had an aptitude for, the same aptitude his father had for operational details, the same quality showing up in the next generation in a different domain. Then she taught him everyday signs that the vocabulary app had gotten subtly wrong, the colloquial versions, the signs that actual deaf communities used rather than the textbook approximations. Then he started teaching her things, signs his school's interpreter had taught him that were different from the ones she knew, regional variations, the living language rather than the archived version. It was not therapy. It was not mentorship in the formal sense. It was two people practicing a language together, one of whom was 8 and one of whom was 34. And between those sessions, something accumulated that didn't have a clean name, but was real and useful and belonged to both of them. Marcus came to collect Ethan on a Monday in week 9 and arrived 20 minutes early, which she suspected was not an accident. He stood in the doorway of the consultation room while Ethan ran through a sequence of signs relating to weather. They had been doing environmental vocabulary that week. And he watched with the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding the order of it. Ethan saw him and signed, "You're early. PT finished fast. That means you were good or they gave up. Neither." They were impressed. Marcus signed it with the particular satisfaction of a man who had worked hard at something and was not ashamed to note the result. His signing was better than it had been. Notably better. The PT facility having a communication-inclusive program that he had apparently thrown himself into with the same intensity he applied to physical rehabilitation. He looked at Emily. "Walk out with us?" She walked out with them, down the corridor, to the elevator, through the lobby, past the mural, which she had stopped counting at 431, and had started experiencing as a painting again, a decent if dated one, with some genuine skill in the hands, and out into the afternoon. Marcus's sister was in the car at the curb. Ethan went to her, pulling open the back door, already signing something about lunch. Emily and Marcus stood on the pavement. "I'm cleared," Marcus said. "Full-duty clearance, effective next week." She looked at him. "That's faster than average." "I was motivated." "What happens next?" "Desk assignment for 60 days, then field eval. The standard." He looked at the car, at Ethan through the window, already deep in a signed conversation with the loud sister. "He's going to stay with me during the desk rotation. His mom and I worked something out. It's not—" He paused. "It's not easy. Between us. But Ethan needed it, and we're both capable of doing hard things when Ethan needs them." "That's a good thing," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "He talks about you, constantly. My sister asked if you were his aunt. I didn't know how to explain what you are." She looked at the pavement. "I'm his sign language practice partner." "That's what you're going to go with?" "For now." He was quiet for a moment. "For now leaves room for later." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in the look that was not a question exactly, and not a statement exactly, but something between them that didn't require resolution in this moment, on this pavement, with his sister in the car and his son watching through the window. It was enough for it to be named by the fact of the look itself, the two of them standing in the recognition of it, which was more honest than rushing toward a language that hadn't found its shape yet. "Drive safe," she said. "Always." He moved toward the car. Then, without turning, "Monday." "Monday," she confirmed. She watched the car leave. She stood on the pavement for a moment, in the afternoon light, in the ordinary air of an ordinary Charleston afternoon, and she felt the weight of what was present rather than the weight of what had been carried for 11 years. And the difference was not everything, but it was a great deal. She went back inside. She went back to work. That was the part nobody told you. Not about recovery, not about justice, not about the long aftermath of being ignored and then seen. Nobody told you that the day after you were vindicated felt largely like a regular Tuesday, that the protocol meetings were tedious even when they mattered, that you still got tired and made small errors and had conversations that didn't go the way you'd planned, that the people who had wronged you didn't disappear into a clean narrative conclusion, but continued to exist in legal processes and institutional reviews and the ongoing complicated life of a city you both lived in. Nobody told you that the strength didn't arrive as a transformation. It had always been there, doing its quiet structural work, holding things up while everything above it changed. You didn't find it. You stopped pretending it wasn't yours. On a Tuesday in week 12, the new ASL interpreter, hired full-time, first in the hospital's history, had her first day. Her name was Dara, and she was 27 and she was deaf herself, which Emily had advocated for specifically in the hiring process, because a communication accessibility program built entirely by hearing people for deaf patients was a particular kind of institutional failure that wore a helpful face, and she had seen enough failures that wore helpful faces to be done with them. Dara came to find Emily at the nurses' station at the end of her first shift. She signed, "Thank you for building this. I've worked in 3 hospitals. This is the first time I've been hired as a full person rather than a service." Emily signed back, "You're going to tell me everything that's still wrong with it." Dara looked at her. Then she smiled, a real one, the smile of someone who had expected to have to fight for the right to have professional opinions and was finding that the fight had already been partially won before she arrived. "Obviously," she signed. Emily turned back to her chart. She had 416 tiles between the nurses' station and the elevator. She had stopped counting at somewhere past 6 months ago. She still knew the number. She knew it the way she knew the 23 seconds on a mountain in a country she couldn't name. The way she knew the specific feeling of a child's wail going quiet in a crowded hallway. The way she knew the pulse under her fingers when it shifted from wrong to right. The way she knew every room in this building, every exit, every gap in the coverage. She was not the person she had been before the operation. She was not the person she had been at the beginning of the 11 years or the end of them or any point in between. She was the person who had arrived here, imperfect, tired on certain mornings, still prone to being right in ways that cost more than they should, still learning how to accept the things offered by the people who offered them genuinely. She was a nurse. She was a charge nurse and a protocol architect and a sign language teacher on Mondays and Thursdays, and the person who had flagged an order and sat on a hallway floor and found a child in a service road and given a statement at a kitchen table and built something out of the 14 cases that should never have been 14 cases. She was also the soldier on the mountain. She had stopped pretending those were 2 different people. There was a version of her story that wanted to be about the medal, the record correction, the board meeting, the moment of public acknowledgement when the institutions that had dismissed her were forced to name her accurately. Those things mattered. She was not going to perform the pretense that they didn't, but the version that was true, the version she had written in the final paragraph of her statement, the version that had found its way into a federal recommendation document, the version she carried when she walked past the mural and through the lobby and onto the floor every morning, was simpler and harder than that. The world did not build systems that remembered the people who fell out of them. The world built systems that processed the people who fit, and documented the ones who didn't and moved on. The people who fell out had to find their way back, or build something adjacent, or become the kind of person who made the system better at catching the next one. She had done all 3, in the end. Not cleanly, not in order. With setbacks and detours and the specific indignity of being underestimated by people who should have known better and sometimes didn't and sometimes did know better and made the easier choice anyway. And she had done it, and the doing of it was not because she was exceptional. The doing of it was because she had decided, somewhere in the middle of a long, hard road, that the alternative was to become the person the casualty report said she was. She was not that person. She had always known that. It had just taken the world a while to catch up.